Good evening. Tonight we drift back along a moonlit river to a kingdom where an old civilization and a new ruling family try to breathe in rhythm with each other. You are on a slow boat, gliding over the dark silk of the Nile, the water whispering against the hull in soft, repetitive sighs. Warm night air settles on your skin, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke from little villages tucked behind the reeds. Low mud brick houses and palm trunks slide past like shadows, while above you the stars crowd the sky, the same constellations priests here have watched for thousands of years. Ahead, a pale glow gathers on the horizon. Alexandria, capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, where Greek colonnades meet Egyptian temples, and the sea breeze tastes of salt, tar, and foreign tongues. You probably won't survive this world without feeling just a bit overwhelmed by the noise of empire, the weight of history, and the delicate egos of kings and queens. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, share your location and the local time where you are right now in the comments, so this river of listeners can see where everyone else is drifting off to sleep from. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boat slides closer and Alexandria takes shape. Straight streets, flat roofs, hidden gardens tucked behind walls. The Pharos lighthouse rises over the harbour, its beacon turning slowly, calling in ships from the dark Mediterranean. This is a planned city, laid out after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in the late 4th century BCE. And after his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, claimed this land and made his line its new royal family. The stones under your imagined feet were never part of an old village. They arrived already inscribed with imperial ambition. In the royal quarter, the Ptolemies speak Greek, write in Greek, and fill their palaces with statues and columns in the style of their Macedonian homeland. But when they step into Egyptian temples, they appear as pharaohs, wearing the double crown, offering to gods whose names were already ancient when Alexander was born. You can almost hear the languages change as you move from room to room in your imagination. Greek in council chambers, Egyptian in temple courts, and a flowing cursive script called Demotic on papyrus records. Some royal decrees, like the one later preserved on the stone we now call the Rosetta Stone, are carved in 3 scripts, so that priest, clerk, and court official all see themselves spoken to. From the harbour, you wander mentally up a broad avenue shaded by colonnades. Stone under your sandals is still warm from the day. Lamps flicker in doorways. Traders stack amphorae of oil and wine. The air smells of fish, resin, and crushed herbs. Somewhere in the royal precinct stands the Mouseion and its library, where scholars collect and copy texts from across the known world. Later stories will turn this place into an almost mythical sea of scrolls, and modern historians still argue gently about how big or organized it really was, but most agree that Alexandria becomes one of the great centers of learning in this period, a city that wants to think of itself as the mind of the Mediterranean. Beyond the marble and lecture halls, the kingdom stretches along the Nile in quieter patterns. Fields depend on the river's yearly flood. Farmers bend over grain and flax, their lives ruled by water levels, taxes, and the moods of local officials. Village temples, with carved stone walls, show rituals in the old Egyptian style, while in nearby markets people haggle in different dialects and, in some places, in Greek. The society you drift through is layered. Greek and Macedonian settlers often hold top offices and own large estates, while Egyptian elites and priestly families hold deep local authority around their temples and land, anchoring villages to traditions that feel immovably old. You pause in an imagined provincial town. A small temple courtyard holds a stone basin and a bit of shade. A young trainee priest repeats an ancient hymn under his breath in a sacred form of Egyptian. At the gate, an administrator from Alexandria arrives, with orders written in Greek and Demotic, asking for updated accounts of fields and offerings, numbers that will join countless others in the royal archive. Both men serve the same king, but their worlds do not quite match. and that quiet mismatch between central power and local tradition never fully goes away. Across the sea to the west, another power is rising. Rome, still a republic in Cleopatra's early world, is expanding, sending armies and governors around the Mediterranean. Egypt trades grain for Roman silver, borrows money from Italian bankers, and sometimes invites Roman generals to help settle royal disputes when succession turns bloody or confused. Some scholars describe this as the long, slow weakening of the Ptolemaic kingdom, strained by debt, internal feuds, and dependence on Roman goodwill. Others emphasize how adaptable the dynasty remains, surviving crises that might have destroyed a less wealthy or less clever state. In the soft night around you, those interpretations drift like two different currents in the same dark water. Back in the royal quarter, you let your thoughts slip through high walls and guarded gates. Palaces look over the sea and the harbour. Floors are laid in bright mosaics that cool bare feet. Bronze lamps scent the air with oil and smoke. At long tables, kings named Ptolemy and queens often named Cleopatra or Berenice dine to the sound of music, while in nearby rooms, scribes add numbers to wax tablets, counting ships, taxes, and obligations to foreign powers. The royal family keeps its bloodline tight by marrying brother to sister, a practice meant to secure the throne but one that traps every rivalry inside the same narrow circle, so that family affection and political fear are always tangled together. You stand on an imaginary balcony above it all, looking out toward the faint line where sea meets sky. Dawn is beginning to touch that line. The Nile below your mind's eye turns from black to deep blue. Birds stir in the reeds. Fishermen push their small boats off muddy banks and drift into the current. In temples along the river, priests in white linen step out to greet the rising sun. In Alexandria, shutters open and servants move quietly through corridors, waking another day of calculation and ceremony to life. Somewhere within these walls, in a morning not too far in the future, a baby girl named Cleopatra will be carried out into the light, inheriting this entire complicated world before she can even hold her head up. For now, you simply breathe with this kingdom at dawn, feeling beneath your feet the deep foundations of older Egypt, and far away but steadily approaching, the pressure of Rome. Cleopatra's story will rise from the meeting point of those forces. From this river kingdom that is dazzling and troubled, at the same time, holding its balance for just a little longer while the water flows quietly past your drifting boat. You stay with that first light as it spills deeper into the royal quarter, and now you find yourself very small, walking barefoot over cool stone floors that are far too wide for you. Servants keep their voices low, sandals whispering, as they move through painted corridors carrying water and folded linen. Somewhere deeper in the palace, a baby's cry rises and falls, brief as a bird call. This is Cleopatra, daughter of King Ptolemy XII, born into rooms that already feel heavy with stories and expectations. You move with her, in imagination, as she grows from that bundle of sound into a child who can toddle along the colonnades. Outside, Alexandria hums. Inside, the air is carefully controlled. Shaded courtyards with pools to cool the breeze. Perfumed oil to soften the dryness of the sea wind. Guards at thresholds where marble gives way to mosaic. Cleopatra's world at first is shapes and colours. The patterned border of a floor, the glitter of gold bracelets on her father's arm, the pale flicker of papyrus, scrolls in a scholar's hand. Her father, Ptolemy XII, bears the pleasant, faintly mocking nickname Orletes, the flute player, a hint that his reputation leans more toward indulgence than stern kingship. You picture him reclined at a banquet, music in the background, while in a quieter room a tutor traces letters on a wax tablet for Cleopatra to copy. Greek letters come first, sharp and familiar, for a Macedonian Greek dynasty. Later, other scripts and sounds join them. Later writers describe Cleopatra as speaking many languages, including Egyptian, and as being unusual among her ancestors for addressing her native subjects without interpreters. Even if the exact count is uncertain, most historians agree she was exceptionally educated and linguistically gifted. You feel that education beginning around her like an intricate net, but it is a soft one at first. She listens to philosophers and poets reciting in book-filled halls, learning the rhythm of speeches that charm or persuade. She hears stories of Alexander the Great and of the early Ptolemies, who once commanded respect across the eastern Mediterranean, back when debts were smaller and Roman envoys did not lean so heavily on the palace doors. Her lessons are not just words on scrolls, they are memories the adults around her carry like invisible burdens. Yet even for a child, the cracks in the dynasty are hard to completely hide. You notice how the adults stop talking when small footsteps approach. A conversation in Greek about money owed to Roman bankers dissolves into a remark about the weather. A worried glance at a document bearing Roman names, perhaps of powerful senators or generals, turns into a smile as Cleopatra appears in the doorway. Some nights, you can almost hear raised voices behind a thick door, a discussion about succession, daughters, sons, and what might happen if the wrong relative reaches for the crown at the wrong time. This is a family, after all, that marries brother to sister and cousin to cousin, entangling affection and rivalry until they cannot be neatly separated. Earlier, Ptolemies have set a pattern. Co-rulers who later turn on one another, uncles who arrange the deaths of nephews, sisters who seize the throne in their brother's absence. Cleopatra grows up with portraits and statues of ancestors whose stories, if told honestly, are as much warnings as they are celebrations. Some scholars suggest that children raised in such an atmosphere must learn early to weigh every smile and gesture for hidden meaning. And as you walk with small Cleopatra through the palace, you can feel her watching, absorbing, filing things away. In one upper room, a tutor unrolls a map. The Nile snakes down it in a line of ink. Cities and nomes, the old administrative districts, are marked in small script. Here is Memphis, older than Alexandria, once a royal seat. Here Thebes, with its temples. Here the tangled delta. Cleopatra listens, and you sense that she already knows some of this from stories told by Egyptian servants, tales of gods, festivals, and village calendars that still follow the river's moods. Her education is not purely Greek. She lives at a cultural crossroads, and later writers imply that she leaned into that complexity rather than away from it. Beyond the maps, there are more abstract lessons: rhetoric, philosophy, law. In a quiet corner of a courtyard, you picture her practicing the art of speaking, choosing words, arranging them so they flow like the Nile, instead of crashing like a sudden storm. She learns how to address a small audience of tutors and attendants, how to hold attention, how to flatter without appearing to do so. In a world where Rome's power is growing, the ability to speak persuasively to foreign envoys will be as important as any army. And somewhere, perhaps without realizing it, Cleopatra is already sharpening that weapon at the edge of ceremonies and processions that periodically fill the streets below her windows. There are always soldiers. Some wear armor and carry shields in Greek and Macedonian style. Others belong to units formed from local populations or hired from abroad. Among them, over time, a particular group of Roman soldiers, those later known as the Gabiniani, left as a garrison by a Roman commander, becomes a fixture in the city, their presence a constant reminder that Egypt's independence is now threaded with Roman interests. A younger Cleopatra might not yet grasp all the implications, but she sees the distinctive helmets, hears Latin curses and jokes, and understands at least that these men answer to more than one master. Eventually, her father's anxieties lead him to Rome itself, seeking support and recognition, and parts of Cleopatra's youth are marked by his absences and the instability they leave behind, while the exact details of which discussions she overhears are lost to history. You can safely imagine the feeling of it. Uncertainty like a draft under a closed door, the sense that the throne under her family is not bolted as securely to the earth as the stone columns around her. In those long evenings, when lamps burn low and voices hush, she may be listening inwardly, already rehearsing the role she might one day have to play if everything around her starts to tilt. Historians differ in how much of Cleopatra's later decisiveness can be traced back to these childhood impressions, but many see her as shaped by an early understanding that her dynasty is both magnificent and precarious, capable of great spectacle and yet deeply vulnerable to its own internal divisions and to the ambitions of Rome. As you trail her through shadowed corridors, you feel how the palace, at first a safe maze of cool rooms and twining staircases, slowly reveals itself as a place where affection is genuine, but never entirely free from calculation. You leave her, for the moment, at a window overlooking the harbour, a young girl watching ships come and go under the turning light of the Pharos. She hears the creak of ropes, the calls of sailors in tongues she is beginning to recognize, the low murmur of the sea that connects her kingdom to powers she cannot yet control. The dynasty that devours itself is also the dynasty that has given her tutors, languages, and a vantage point over the world. Standing beside her in imagination, you can feel how the currents of family, city, and empire are already swirling quietly around her ankles, preparing for the day when she will have to step off the sill and into the deep water of rule. Time moves the way the Nile does, almost imperceptibly at first. Then suddenly you notice the banks have changed. The small girl at the window grows taller, her steps become more confident on those polished floors. Voices no longer hush when she enters, they shift instead, making space for her in conversations about grain, envoys, and the mood of the city. Outside the palace, storms have come and gone. Her father has faced exile and restoration, leaving Alexandria in uneasy hands, and then returning with Roman support to reclaim his throne. In that turmoil, one of Cleopatra's older sisters, Berenice, briefly held power before being swept away when Ptolemy XII returned. The exact words spoken in those final confrontations are lost, but the message to a watching daughter is clear enough. In this family, thrones are taken, lost, and sometimes paid for with lives. You feel how that lesson settles in her bones as she moves through the palace as a teenager. She has watched Roman generals ride in with the ease of men who know they are needed. She has seen her father's dependence on foreign support and heard, perhaps from anxious officials, how deep the kingdom's debts to Rome have become. The gold and marble around her glow just as brightly, but you can sense how much of it is already promised, like jewelry secretly pawned. Then, in 51 BCE, the air in the palace changes. Ptolemy XII dies, and the mourning rituals begin. Incense thick in high halls, blackened garments, formal laments. Cleopatra is about 18. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, is still a boy, perhaps around 10 or 11. The father's will, shaped under Roman influence, calls for them to rule together, co-rulers bound in marriage as tradition within the dynasty demands. Somewhere, probably in Rome, politicians nod in approval. Egypt's succession has been arranged in a way that promises continuity and Roman leverage. You stand with Cleopatra in imagination as she prepares for her new role. The coronation is ritualized and precise. Priests from ancient temples come to invoke gods whose names have sounded along this river for millennia. Greek courtiers, dressed in their finest, form tight clusters of whispers around the edges. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII appear together, adorned in symbols that stitch Greek and Egyptian worlds. Diadems, perhaps the double crown when shown in Egyptian style, fine linen, and jewel-bright fabrics. The crowd sees two sovereigns. Behind them, you can feel the shadows of tutors, regents, and advisors who hope to steer the child king and his young sister. In the months that follow, the kingdom's documents begin dating themselves from the new reign. Scribes dip reeds into ink, carefully writing formulas that mention both names. On some official texts, Cleopatra's name appears first, a small detail that later scholars will pore over, wondering whether it signals her attempt to assert primacy over her brother. Other evidence suggests that as the years pass, Ptolemy the Saithes, circle of guardians, figures like the eunuch Pothinus, and the general Achilles push back, trying to emphasize the boy king's authority. You can almost hear the quiet tug of war in how decrees are phrased and in whose name orders are actually carried out. Beyond the palace walls, Egypt is under strain. The Nile's annual flooding, which feeds the fields, has been poor. Harvests suffer, and with them, the kingdom's ability to pay soldiers and creditors. In some regions, scarcity bites hard. The same river you drifted along peacefully now carries fewer fully laden grain boats. At village markets, prices rise and tempers fray. In response, the court issues some tax remissions and adjustments, gestures meant to keep both peasants and temple estates from sinking entirely. You can picture the scene in a provincial office, an official unrolling a new decree that lightens burdens slightly, his relief tempered by the knowledge that the royal need for revenue hasn't vanished. At the same time, Rome's presence feels heavier. The competing Roman strongmen, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, have divided spheres of influence, and Egypt falls within a zone where Roman interest is intense. Roman tax collectors, bankers, and envoys move through Alexandria's streets, speaking Latin and Greek, meeting with royal officials in shady courtyards and high-ceilinged audience halls. Cleopatra, now queen, sits through audiences where Roman names and demands thread through every conversation, like a constant refrain. Some historians see her in these early years as attempting to assert real authority, personally meeting officials, and perhaps even traveling within the country to secure loyalty. Others are more cautious, noting that the fragmentary sources leave many details uncertain. You, listening in the dim light, can feel that uncertainty as part of her story, rather than a flaw in it. Inside the palace, the co-rule is officially one of harmony. In public ceremonies, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII appear side by side, offering to the gods, receiving embassies, inspecting troops. Musicians play, the crowd cheers. The imagery presented to the people is one of unity. But when the curtains fall, competing circles of influence swirl around each sovereign. The boy king's handlers want to maintain their control. Cleopatra, with her broader education and likely stronger personality, is not inclined to be a figurehead. One evening in your imagination, you sit quietly near a half-open door as voices rise in a council chamber. They argue about money owed to Rome, about whether to grant concessions to certain temples, about the handling of the Gabiniani, the Roman troops left in Egypt years earlier, who have grown comfortable, even unruly, in their adopted home. Some advisors urge cautious cooperation with Roman demands. Others bristle at the humiliation of bending too far. At the center of this, Cleopatra must choose which counsel to heed, fully aware that each choice will create enemies. It is in these everyday negotiations, as much as in the later dramatic alliances with famous Romans, that her political instincts are honed. She speaks multiple languages, understands something of Egyptian religion as well as Greek philosophy, and can read, in the faces of priests and provincial delegations, how deeply royal decisions cut. You see her meet emissaries from temples, listening to their concerns about land, ritual, and privilege. You see her weigh the relief of easing their burdens against the reality of obligations to Roman creditors. Historians sometimes differ on how successful she was in stabilizing the kingdom at this stage, but most agree that she is not passive, not content to let others think for her. The tension between her and the faction around Ptolemy XIII slowly thickens, like the air before a storm. Small signs appear. Officials aligned with Cleopatra find themselves sidelined. Certain decrees favor the boy king's name more prominently. Access to the young pharaoh, supposedly her co-ruler and husband, becomes more tightly controlled by his guardians. It is easy, looking back, to see the path toward open conflict. But in the moment, it probably feels like a series of small affronts and cautious countermoves, each one leaving a faint mark on the queen's patience. You return for a moment to the balcony where she once stood as a child. Now she stands there as queen, the diadem pressing lightly against her hair, the city spread out like a board for a game whose rules are changing. Below, torches move through the streets. In the harbour, the silhouettes of ships rock gently. Somewhere, perhaps beyond the horizon, Roman leaders are already calculating how Egypt's instability might serve their purposes. In the palace behind her, a young brother is growing into a tool for others' ambitions. Some scholars see Cleopatra's early co-reign as the period when she learns, with painful clarity, that images of shared power can hide realities of isolation, and that a queen in her position must either assert herself boldly or be slowly pushed aside. Others caution that our surviving sources come mainly from later Roman writers, colored by politics and hindsight, making it hard to know exactly how much control she truly wielded. As you watch her straighten her shoulders and turn back into the palace, you can hold both views at once. A young woman stepping onto a stage half lit, where the lines she has to speak are partly written for her and partly waiting to be invented on the spot. The kingdom she shares officially with her brother is already shaken, burdened by debt, threatened by famine, watched hungrily by Rome. Yet in these corridors, with their painted walls and echoing steps, Cleopatra is still at the beginning of her reign, still testing how far her voice will carry. Soon, those quiet struggles will spill into open conflict, and the girl who once traced the Nile on maps will find herself exiled from her own capital, calculating from the desert's edge how to reclaim a throne that seems to be slipping downriver without her. The storm you felt gathering inside the palace finally breaks, not with thunder, but with whispers that spread through corridors faster than any wind. You sense it first in the way doors close just a little too quickly as Cleopatra approaches, in the way certain officials bow to her with a stiffness that feels more like farewell than loyalty. The careful balance between queen and boy king has tipped, and not in her favor. One morning, the air in the royal quarter seems oddly thin. Orders have been given in the night. Guards, who once stood at Cleopatra's side, now avoid her eyes. Pothinus, the eunuch guardian of Ptolemy XIII, along with the general Achilles and the rhetorician Theodotus, are quietly tightening their grip on the young king, and by extension, on Egypt itself. You can almost feel the ground shifting under her sandals as she realizes that the faction behind her brother intends to push her aside completely. So she leaves, not in a blaze of ceremony, but in retreat, stepping out of the city that was hers to rule. In your mind, you follow her caravan eastward, away from Alexandria's stone boulevards, and out into the open land that slopes towards Syria and Palestine. The air becomes drier, the scent of the sea fades, replaced by dust and sun-warmed rock. At night, the sky is enormous, stars flung across it without the soft haze of coastal humidity. Exile is not quiet for her. In these borderlands, she begins to gather support soldiers from local regions, mercenaries who will fight for pay, minor rulers who see advantage in backing a displaced queen. Ancient sources hint at her raising forces in Syria before trying to return. Modern historians differ on the size and exact movements of her army, but most agree that she does not simply vanish. She prepares. You can picture her in a temporary camp, seated beneath a richly woven canopy in the dark, maps spread before her, lamps drawing a circle of light around her intent face. Meanwhile, back across the Mediterranean, another, larger conflict is unraveling. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies in Rome's tangled politics, have turned on each other. Civil war tears through the Roman world. You feel its distant vibrations reach Egypt as news arrives in fragments. Legions marching, battles fought in Greece, senators fleeing, letters arriving with broken seals and urgent handwriting. Rome's leaders have long treated Egypt as both ally and resource. Now, their own struggle spills toward Cleopatra's troubled kingdom. In 48 BCE, Caesar defeats Pompey at Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey, seeking refuge and perhaps support, chooses Egypt, counting on old connections with Ptolemy XII and the prestige of the Ptolemaic court. You drift back to Alexandria in your imagination as his ship appears off the coast, the city shimmering in the sun. But the men now advising Ptolemy XIII see opportunity of a darker kind. Hoping to impress Caesar and secure favor, they arrange Pompey's murder as he comes ashore, a killing carried out, according to ancient accounts, in front of his wife and son. The scene is brutal, but you only need to feel the cold calculation behind it. A body, once a powerful Roman general, left in the surf, a severed head, preserved as a gruesome gift. When Caesar arrives shortly afterward, the advisors present him with what they think he wants, proof that his rival is gone. Instead, Caesar is reportedly appalled, turning his face away. You can sense in that misjudgment the crack that will widen into the Alexandrian War. Caesar decides to remain in Alexandria to settle the Egyptian succession, a matter that now intersects with Roman interests. He installs himself in the royal quarter, effectively making the palace a Roman-occupied space. From this unexpected presence, orders go out. Both Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra are to come and present their cases. The boy king and his faction are nearby. Cleopatra is outside the city. With forces and pride she cannot simply abandon. She understands at once what is at stake. If she does not get close to Caesar, close enough to speak directly, the men around her brother will frame the story as they wish. But Pharaoh's palace is now in hostile hands, and for her to walk openly through its gates would be to invite arrest, or worse. This is where legend and history intertwine like threads on a loom, and you can feel them knotting themselves around her next choice. Ancient writers tell a famous story. Cleopatra has herself smuggled into the palace, wrapped in a bundle sometimes described as a rug, sometimes a bed sack carried by a loyal attendant. In the most vivid version, the bundle is unrolled before Caesar, and out steps the queen, suddenly there, in the lamplight, graceful from the folds. Modern scholars point out that the exact logistics are fuzzy, and that later retellings may have polished the scene for drama. But many accept that some form of clandestine entry did occur. You can safely keep the image, while knowing the details are blurred by time. So you imagine it slowly, gently, in a chamber lit by oil lamps. The air is thick with the smell of smoke and the faint tang of seawater from open shutters. Caesar, older than Cleopatra by decades, sits among documents and messengers, worn by campaign and politics. Servants bring in a long, tightly wrapped bundle, claiming it is a gift or bedding. It is placed on the floor. For a moment, nothing happens beyond the creak of wicker and the soft mutter of guards. Then fabric stirs, a hand appears, pushing aside folds, and Cleopatra emerges from confinement into the room. She straightens, clothing slightly creased, hair perhaps a little disordered, eyes already assessing the man before her. You stand at the edge of this picture, feeling the tension and the audacity. She has crossed the threshold of danger to speak face to face with the most powerful Roman alive. Whatever words pass between them at first are lost, but their outcome is not. Cleopatra presents her case, that she is rightful queen, that her brother's advisors have driven her out, that stability in Egypt requires her restoration. Caesar, in turn, sees more than a family quarrel. He sees a chance to shape Egypt's future and secure a vital grain supply under a ruler favorable to him. Some ancient accounts emphasize her charm and presence. Modern interpretations tend to balance that with the clear political alignment of interests. Historians still argue over where personal attraction ends and strategic calculation begins, but it is probably safest to see both woven together. Outside that lamplit room, Alexandria holds its breath. Ptolemy XII's faction soon realizes that Cleopatra has reached Caesar and that their attempt to control the narrative has failed. Anger and fear ripple through their ranks. The city, already uneasy from Roman soldiers, sharing its streets with Alexandrian guards, and the unruly Gabiniani, grows more tense. Rumors slide like shadows along the colonnades. The queen is back in the palace. Caesar favors her. The boy king is furious. The army is restless. You walk in your imagination through those streets at dusk. The air off the harbour is cooler now, touched by the evening breeze. Torches begin to flare in doorways. Groups of men speak in low tones. At the palace gates, guards shift their weight, hands on spears, eyes watching for orders that haven't come yet. Beneath the surface, the city is like a bronze vessel, heating slowly over a flame. Inside, a Roman general and an exiled queen have made an agreement that will soon bring the water to a boil. For Cleopatra, the gamble has paid its first dividend. She is no longer a fugitive camped in the borderlands. She is back in the heart of power, her presence sanctified by Roman recognition. Yet the cost of that return is not yet fully written. Caesar's decision to back her will draw Alexandria into the currents of Rome's civil war more deeply than ever. What began as an exile and a daring entry under cloth is about to swell into open conflict, fires in the streets, and battles fought among the columns and harbours she once walked as a child. For now, you leave her in the palace, perhaps in a newly prepared suite of rooms, lamps burning low, the murmur of Roman voices drifting through the walls. She has slipped past the gates of her own city in secret, rolled in fabric and carried like cargo, only to stand upright again as queen before a foreign general. The night outside is quiet, but you can sense how thin that quiet has become, like the skin of the Nile just before the first stones of war are thrown in. Morning in Alexandria comes with the faint metallic taste of fear in the air. You can sense it as you drift through the palace precinct, where Roman sentries and Alexandrian guards now eye one another with forced calm. Caesar has declared that he will arbitrate the succession, reading out the will of Ptolemy XII, and insisting that Cleopatra and Ptolemy XII share the throne as their father intended. On the surface, this sounds like balance restored. Underneath, it feels more like a fragile plank laid across a widening crack. You imagine yourself at the edge of a vast audience hall as Caesar speaks, his Latin words flowing through interpreters into Greek. Cleopatra and Ptolemy II stand not far apart, but the distance between them is the length of a war. Caesar calls for reconciliation. For a moment, the room holds its breath, but in the streets beyond, the Boy King's faction is already working, stirring up anger at Roman interference and the presence of foreign troops in the royal quarter. Soon the city starts to change. Crowds form at corners, voices sharp, pointing toward the palace, where a foreign general seems to be dictating Egypt's future. Pothinus and his allies, wary of Cleopatra's closeness to Caesar, decide on a bolder move. An Egyptian army under Achilles advances toward Alexandria, aiming to encircle the palace area and, if possible, eliminate Caesar and his small Roman force altogether. The Gabiniani, those Roman soldiers who have gone native over the years, mostly side with the Egyptian commanders rather than with the newly arrived Caesar, a detail that must have felt like betrayal to him and like an opportunity to his enemies. You walk in imagination through the palace gardens as the first sounds carry in, distant shouts, the thud of marching feet, the clatter of preparations. Caesar reacts quickly. He seizes control of parts of the harbour and the palace quarter, securing the king's person as leverage. Ptolemy XIII, once a tool of his advisors, now finds himself effectively a hostage in Roman hands. Cleopatra, in turn, moves within these fortified spaces, suddenly living in a city where stepping beyond certain streets could mean stepping into enemy lines. Then the siege tightens. Achilles' forces push in, occupying large parts of Alexandria. Narrow streets become barricades. Rooftop edges host archers whose arrows arc across the bright, dust-heavy sky. From the palace quarter, you peer down an avenue that used to smell of incense and roasting fish, and now smells of smoke and fear. The war that would later be called the Alexandrian War has begun, not as a glorious clash on open fields, but as a tight, grinding struggle inside a crowded city. Caesar's own later account, though debated in authorship by modern scholars, describes his situation as precarious, outnumbered, cut off, having to improvise defenses with limited forces. You can feel that improvisation as you watch Roman soldiers reinforce walls, throw up makeshift fortifications out of stone and timber, and anchor ships in defensive lines across parts of the harbour. Supplies become a daily concern. Every loaf of bread, every amphora of water must be guarded and accounted for. Somewhere within this enclosed world, Cleopatra moves through shaded corridors, the sounds of battle drifting in like distant waves. Her position is both vital and vulnerable. Caesar's support keeps her claim alive. His defeat would likely mean her death or permanent exile. Although our sources focus more on Caesar's maneuvers than on her daily role, you can imagine the quiet councils where she sits beside him, sharing knowledge of the city's layout, supply routes, and the personalities of local leaders. Some historians think she played an active advisory role. Others are more cautious, reminding us that Roman accounts naturally center Roman perspectives. Either way, her fate is now fully tied to the outcome of this siege. One day, you stand with her at a window overlooking the harbour as smoke suddenly thickens. Caesar has ordered ships burned to keep them from falling into enemy hands. Flames leap up, licking at rigging and sails. Black columns twist into the sky. The fire doesn't respect boundaries. Carried by wind and fed by warehouses along the quays, it spreads ash and embers over parts of the city. Later stories will say that this conflagration reaches nearby storehouses of scrolls, damaging part of the great Alexandrian library's collections. Modern scholars still argue about how extensive that damage was. Is it the beginning of the library's end, or one of several blows over centuries? But nearly all agree that this urban war leaves scars, not just on people and palaces, but on knowledge itself. As days stretch into weeks, the siege grows more complex. Pothinus is eventually discovered to be in secret communication with Achilles and is executed on Caesar's orders. A cold, swift act meant to eliminate a dangerous traitor inside the walls. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, manages to escape the palace and reach Achilles' camp, where she is proclaimed queen by the soldiers. In the shifting politics of the moment, commanders quarrel. Achilles is killed, and another figure, Ganymedes, rises to direct the siege. You can almost hear the arguments in that outer camp. Competing claims, accusations of betrayal, promises to the king, to Arsinoe, to Egypt itself. Within Caesar's perimeter, water becomes a concern when Ganymedes tampers with the supply, forcing the Romans to dig wells and stretch their resources further. You picture soldiers at dawn, sweaty and dust-covered, hauling up buckets from freshly dug pits, their armor clinking, their Latin curses floating up into the warming air. The river that once seemed an endless source of life now feels distant and contested, like everything else. Relief begins to move towards Caesar from outside. Forces gathered under Mithridates of Pergamum advance through the region, pushing toward Egypt. Hearing this, you sense a flicker of hope in the beleaguered palace quarter. But that hope must cross difficult terrain and hostile troops. Eventually, Caesar slips out with part of his force to coordinate with these reinforcements. The struggle shifts from city streets to the wider Nile region. In your mind, you travel with them to the banks of the river, where the decisive engagements take place. This is no grand cinematic sea battle. It is a harsh, confusing mix of river fighting and land clashes. Boats grind against each other in muddy water. Missile fire arcs from deck to deck. Men shout over the rush of the current. Ptolemy XIII, still very young, is present with his forces. As the battle turns against him and his supporters, he attempts to flee. According to ancient accounts, he drowns in the Nile, his body later recovered, still wearing royal armor. You let that image stay blurred at the edges, keeping its violence soft. But you feel the symbolism. A boy king swallowed by the river that defined his kingdom. With his death, resistance crumbles. Caesar and his allies gain the upper hand. Alexandria, exhausted, slowly unwinds from the tight coil of siege. Smoke stains fade from some walls, but never completely clear. Broken stones lie where they fell. Certain streets will remember the echo of marching feet long after the noise has died down. Inside the palace, the question of who will rule is answered with new arrangements. Cleopatra is confirmed as queen, now paired with a younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as co-ruler, a familiar dynastic formula, but with the balance of power clearly weighted toward her. Arsinoe, captured, is taken away from Egypt to await Caesar's triumph in Rome. Her brief queenship in the besieging camp ends with chains and a long journey west. The Gabiniani who chose the losing side meet harsh fates. Others melt back into the city's population or into the anonymity of history. The Alexandrian War, though a relatively small episode in the sweep of Roman conquest, has reshaped Egypt's inner landscape, burning away one faction and leaving Caesar's chosen queen standing amid the smoke. You return in your thoughts to the royal quarter after the fighting. The gardens are being replanted. Workmen patch walls and repair colonnades. The harbour is quieter, its waters reflecting a sky slowly clearing of ash. Cleopatra walks again along corridors that once felt like a trap and now feel, at least for the moment, like secure ground. She owes that security to Caesar, and she knows it. Egypt has been rebalanced, but that balance leans heavily toward Rome. Some scholars see her from this point on as a client queen, bound tightly to Roman interests. Others emphasize the ways she will later assert an independent path. As you watch her pause by a window and look out over her city, you can sense that debate forming, even though it belongs to historians centuries away. For now, the siege has lifted. The fires have died. The queen remains, her position forged in the heat of an urban war. The Nile still flows, indifferent and steady, and soon, its calm waters will carry Cleopatra and Caesar together on a very different kind of journey, one that blends display, politics, and something more personal, as the kingdom tries to catch its breath after so much smoke and steel. The smoke has barely drifted away from Alexandria's rooftops when the river begins to cool again. You feel it in the way the air softens around the harbour, in the quiet, practical preparations that start to hum beneath the surface of the city. Ships are repaired, outfitted, and painted. A different kind of fleet is coming together now, not for siege, but for spectacle. You find yourself on the quay as dawn washes pale gold over the water. The Nile's mouth receives the sea in a gentle, complicated mingling, and anchored here is a larger vessel, slowly taking shape in your imagination. A royal barge, wide and low, built for comfort more than speed. Craftsmen fit carved panels along its sides, paint lotus patterns in muted blues and reds, and erect a canopy that will cast deep shade over those who stand at its center. Caesar and Cleopatra are going to sail upriver. Ancient writers tell you plainly that they travel together on the Nile after the war, on a voyage of display and exploration. They do not agree on every detail, but the broad strokes are clear. The Queen and the Roman general share a progress along the river, accompanied by a glittering entourage. Some later Romans will mutter that Caesar, lingering in Egypt, is being drawn into a foreign monarchy. Others will see the journey as part survey, part celebration. Historians today sift between those tones, wondering how much was romantic retreat, how much careful inspection of a client kingdom, and how much a deliberate performance of pharaonic grandeur with a Roman audience of one. From your place on the deck, the day begins with the soft scrape of ropes and the low grunt of men pushing off from the bank. Oars dip, catch, and pull. The harbour widens into the first stretched reach of the Nile proper, and Alexandria retreats slowly behind you, its lighthouse shrinking to a pale pillar under the rising sun. The sailors call to each other in Egyptian and Greek. Roman soldiers, those loyal to Caesar, stand watchfully among Cleopatra's guards, bronze catching the light. Under the rich canopy, Cleopatra and Caesar occupy a shaded space that feels both open and enclosed. She is a queen now firmly reinstated, dressed in linen that falls lightly in the warmth, adorned with jewelry that glows but does not clatter. He is a general whose name already bends the politics of the Mediterranean, in a tunic cut for ease rather than ceremony, carrying the marks of long campaigns on his face. Around them, attendants move with trays of fruit, water, and wine. Nearby, scribes and interpreters stand ready. As much a part of this journey as the oarsmen, the river itself becomes your guide. Date palms lean over the banks, fields flatten into neat, watered grids, water wheels creak, lifting river water into channels that shine like quicksilver in the early light. Children in villages pause in their morning chores to watch the passing flotilla, shading their eyes. Some shout and point, others simply stare at the brief apparition of royal and foreign power, gliding past them on the current. This voyage is not just a pleasure trip. You can sense Cleopatra using it the way older pharaohs once used river processions, to show herself to her land, to visit temples that anchor the kingdom in divine order, to reassure local elites that the upheavals in Alexandria have settled into a new, stable pattern with her at the center. At each significant stop, barges draw up to stone quays or simple embankments. Priests come out to greet the queen and the Roman. Incense curls into the hot air. Sacred images are carried in processions. Ritual words sound in Egyptian tones that Caesar likely follows through translators' murmurs. You imagine them at Memphis, the ancient capital near the apex of the delta, where statues of earlier kings look on with unseeing stone eyes. Cleopatra walks between massive columns carved long before her dynasty arrived. Caesar, wary and curious, studies the architecture, the cults, the sheer age of it all. In reliefs on temple walls, pharaohs present offerings to gods, their bodies stylized, their crowns tall. Now, for a brief moment, these ancient images are echoed by the living figures passing beneath them. a Greek-Egyptian queen playing pharaoh, and a Roman dictator in all but name. In some towns, local officials present reports and petitions. A scribe unfurls a papyrus roll, hands steady despite the presence of soldiers and royalty. He speaks of flood levels, harvest yields, boundary disputes, or temple privileges. Cleopatra listens attentively, asking questions through interpreters when needed. Caesar watches, learning. It is one thing to read statistics on grain shipments in a Roman office. It is another to see the black earth itself, to understand how the wealth that feeds Rome depends on this narrow green band along the river. On the barge between stops, the pace slows. The sun climbs higher. Curtains are lowered on the river-facing side to soften the glare. Musicians pluck strings and blow softly into flutes. A storyteller might be invited to recite episodes from Homer or local Egyptian tales. There is time for conversation, and with it, the weaving of an alliance that is at once personal and political. You stay just behind their shoulders in your imagination, close enough to feel the rhythm of their exchange without needing every word. Cleopatra knows that Caesar's protection has restored her. She also knows that Romans back home are quick to criticize any sign that their leaders are compromising themselves with foreign luxury. Caesar, in turn, sees in her a ruler who can keep Egypt orderly and productive while he turns back to the fracturing republic. Whether you picture their bond as primarily strategic, deeply affectionate, or something in between, historians agree that the connection is strong enough to unsettle Rome and to reshape Cleopatra's future. As the days turn, the voyage becomes a kind of moving court. Decisions are made on deck and in small cabins where maps are spread and figures debated. Roman officers ask practical questions about distances, supply routes, and potential threats. Alexandrian administrators provide answers that only long familiarity with the Nile can give. A Greek scholar on board might comment on Herodotus' descriptions of Egypt. An Egyptian priest quietly corrects some of the older travelers' misunderstandings, offering a more precise local view. The barge becomes, briefly, a floating intersection of three worlds. A lesser-known but telling feature of these royal journeys is their careful staging. Egyptian kings of earlier dynasties often undertook ritual circuits, visiting key cult centers along the river to affirm order. You feel that tradition echoing here. Wherever Cleopatra disembarks, she appears in forms appropriate to that place. More Egyptian in temple spaces, more Greek in formal banquets, always attuned to the audience's expectations. Caesar, who has seen many cultures in his campaigns, cannot fail to notice how smoothly she shifts between these personas. Some scholars suggest that part of her power lay precisely in this fluidity, in her ability to inhabit different worlds without seeming false. At night, the temperature drops a little, and the river smells of cool water and damp earth. Torches flicker on the decks. The murmur of conversation softens. You stand at the rail, watching reflections of flame break and remake themselves on the slow current. Somewhere on this journey, a new life begins. Cleopatra becomes pregnant. The boy she will later present to the world as Ptolemy XV, called Caesarion, will embody in his very name the knot tying her house to Caesar's. The exact moment of his conception is not for you to pinpoint. The sources do not map such private things, and it is gentler to leave them in the soft blur of a warm river night. Far away in Rome, senators and magistrates begin to grumble at the length of Caesar's stay in Egypt. They worry that Egypt's luxury might soften him, that he might be tempted to adopt the trappings of a Hellenistic monarch. Rumors travel faster than ships, and by the time your barge is drifting among Upper Nile temples, voices in the Roman capital are already shaping narratives about a conqueror lingering in the embrace of an Eastern queen. Some modern historians think these worries are exaggerated by later moralists. Others note that the suspicion of going Eastern was a very real political danger for any Roman leader. Eventually, the voyage turns back. The barges pivot downstream. The current becomes an ally. Villagers that watched the royal procession pass one way now see it return, perhaps with slightly different banners, perhaps with wordless changes in the way guards carry themselves. Cleopatra has shown herself on the river in the old pharaonic style. Caesar has seen the spine of Egypt and measured its strength and vulnerability. Between them, an understanding has taken shape that will outlast the trip itself. You glide back toward Alexandria with them as the light one evening turns the water the color of burnished copper. The city rises again out of the haze, a line of roofs and colonnades, the Pharos lifting its steady lamp. For Cleopatra, returning means stepping once more into the complexities of court and governance. Now, as the acknowledged partner of Rome's most powerful man, and as the expectant mother of a child whose very existence will raise questions no decree can fully smooth away. For Caesar, it means tightening his grip on affairs, here and then, soon, turning his face back toward a Rome not yet ready for the changes he embodies. The oars ease, ropes fly, wood thuds against stone as the barge comes to rest at the quay. The voyage has been both a display to her people and a quiet education for him. As you follow them down the gangplank in your thoughts, the river behind you slides on, as it always does, carrying with it reflections of royal banners that will soon be gone, and of a partnership whose consequences are only beginning to unfold. When the barge kisses the stone of the Alexandrian quay and the oars fall still, you can feel the spell of the river voyage gradually give way to the rougher texture of politics again. Life settles into a new pattern. Caesar moving between affairs in Egypt and messages from Rome. Cleopatra ruling from her palace with an unusual degree of Roman presence humming beneath the marble. Time folds. The city breathes. Somewhere within these months, perhaps in a quiet upper room, with shutters half drawn against the heat, Cleopatra gives birth to a son. You imagine the room smelling faintly of palm oil and crushed flowers, attendants moving softly, voices kept low. The child is named Ptolemy XV, but almost at once, people begin to murmur another name. Caesarion, Little Caesar. That murmur will never entirely fade, no matter how loudly some Romans insist on ignoring it. The boy is a living question. Did Caesar formally acknowledge him? Ancient sources differ. Some suggest Cleopatra believed or claimed that he had. Others insist that Caesar never publicly named any child, but his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, Octavian, as heir. Modern historians weigh the evidence cautiously, noting that Antony later proclaims Caesarion to be Caesar's son, while Octavian strenuously denies it. You feel that uncertainty hanging over the cradle like a veil. This child is at once a blessing and a potential spark for future fires. Caesar cannot stay in Egypt forever. The Roman world still roils with unfinished wars and unsettled politics. In 47 BCE he departs, leaving behind garrisons and agreements, and sails toward new campaigns in Asia Minor and Africa. You stand with Cleopatra on a balcony as his ships shrink into the bright distance, their sails small pale triangles against the glare. The harbour wind tugs at the folds of her clothing. Somewhere behind her, the baby stirs, attended by nurses. In the years that follow, she rules. This is easier said than done, but you can sense her sliding into the daily work of governance, hearing petitions, overseeing finances, managing relations with temples and local elites. Egypt needs stability. Grain needs to flow. And creditors, especially those tied to Rome, need to be paid. Some papyri from her reign preserve decrees that lighten certain tax burdens or confirm privileges for temples and officials. Her name in those texts becomes a steady presence, ink on fibre, holding together the fragile fabric of her authority. Rome itself draws her westward again. In 46 BCE, with Caesar now master of the Roman state after successive victories over his enemies, Cleopatra travels to Rome with her young son. You follow her across the Mediterranean in your imagination. The sea, a rolling expanse of grey-blue, the ship's timbers creaking. Caesarion is small, perhaps barely steady on his feet. Nurses hold him carefully on deck, shading him from the sun as the distant Italian coast slowly takes form. Rome is a different kind of city than Alexandria, rougher at the edges, built not as a planned grid but as a tangle of ancient streets climbing its hills. Yet it too has its statue-crowded forums, its temples, its smell of smoke and sweat and animals. Caesar, as dictator, arranges lodging for Cleopatra across the Tiber in a villa outside the old, sacred heart of the city. You walk there with her, across bridges where the river below runs narrower and muddier than the Nile, through lanes where Latin voices rise and fall around her, like a different kind of current. Her presence is both dazzling and unsettling to the Romans. Cleopatra is not just any foreign guest. She is a queen, ruler of a rich kingdom, and perceived lover of the man who now dominates Roman politics. In the Forum of Caesar, a new temple to Venus, Genetrix, Venus, the ancestress, is dedicated, and ancient sources report that among its art and images stands a gilded statue of Cleopatra in Egyptian dress, perhaps in the guise of a goddess like Isis. It is a startling sight. An Egyptian queen's image, placed in a Roman temple, tied to Caesar's own lineage. Scholars still debate exactly what message Caesar intended by this, and how Romans interpreted it, but you can easily feel why some saw it as a step toward blending Roman and Eastern symbols in ways that made traditionalists nervous. In Rome, Cleopatra must move carefully. She is watched constantly by curiosity, by envy, by suspicion. Senators, wives, whisper about her clothes, her manner, her rumored influence. Philosophically minded, Romans debate whether Caesar, already accused of aspiring to kingship, is letting himself be seduced by the glamour of Hellenistic monarchy. Some later writers even repeat rumors that he planned to move the seat of power eastward, perhaps to Alexandria, though most modern historians treat such claims with caution, seeing them as products of hostility rather than as hard plans. In quieter moments, you step with her into the villa gardens. The plants are different here. Italian shrubs, fig trees, and cypresses, the air scented with rosemary and the dust of the nearby road. She holds Caesarion's hand as he toddles along a path, his small sandals scuffing gravel. He is a foreign child in this city, but his possible paternity makes him the center of a web of unspoken thoughts. If he is Caesar's son, what does that mean for Octavian, the carefully groomed heir? What does it mean for Rome itself, if a boy half Egyptian could one day claim any kind of authority here? Historians disagree on how seriously Romans around them took such possibilities at the time. Some see Cleopatra's stay in Rome as a brief, glittering episode that mostly fed gossip. Others suggest that the presence of the queen and her son in Caesar's orbit added a real, if unspoken, tension to his ambitious reforms. In your mind, you hear both arguments as background whispers, while you watch her sit under a pergola, listening to distant sounds of political debate in a city that is not hers. Then comes a day in March, 44 BCE. The air is still cool, the light thin and sharp. Caesar prepares to go to a meeting of the Senate at the Theatre of Pompey. You do not need to follow him inside. Later stories have done that at length. You stay instead in the quieter spaces of the city, where news will arrive in broken words. The first rumors come as small shocks. Something has happened. Something terrible. Caesar attacked. People cluster in alleys and porticos. Faces tighten. Voices drop. Soon the outline emerges. Caesar has been killed by a group of senators, stabbed in the very heart of Rome's political space. In the villa, across the Tiber, you feel the impact as a single, heavy blow. For Cleopatra, this is not merely the death of an ally or lover. It is the collapse of the structure that has supported her place in the wider Mediterranean order. Without Caesar, her presence in Rome becomes dangerous, even untenable. The factions that now scramble for power, led by figures like Mark Antony and Octavian, have their own priorities. Some may see value in her. Others may see only a foreign entanglement to be cut. She does what she has learned to do in moments of sudden danger. She withdraws and recalculates. Before long, you are on the deck of a ship again, with her in your mind, sailing eastward back toward Egypt. The winter-chilled air on the sea tastes different now, sharper, seasoned with shock and uncertainty. Caesarion is with her. Whatever his father's formal stance in life, his existence in the aftermath is a possible threat to some Romans and a possible instrument to others. Back in Alexandria, the news of Caesar's death ripples outward through the palace and the city. Cleopatra must position herself quickly in a changing world. She has lost her most powerful protector in Rome, but she still has her throne, her treasury, and her knowledge of how to balance Egyptian tradition with foreign demands. In 44 BCE, she moves to secure her dynasty's internal arrangements. Ptolemy XIV, the younger brother, who was nominally her co-ruler during the years with Caesar, disappears from the record, and Caesarion is elevated as co-king beside her. Ancient accounts imply that Ptolemy XIV likely died at this time, possibly by poison. Cautious historians note the convenience of his death for Cleopatra's plans, but refrain from claiming certainty about methods. You stand at a respectful distance from that shadowed transition, feeling only how the formal titles change. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XV now rule together. Outside Egypt, Rome spirals into another round of turmoil as Antony, Octavian, and others struggle to define the future of the Republic or whatever will replace it. Envoys come and go from Alexandria, bearing letters, offers, and demands. Cleopatra reads them in her high-ceilinged chambers, the light from the windows falling across wax tablets and papyrus. She measures the strengths of the claimants, weighs their tempers and histories, and considers which alignment might best secure Egypt's autonomy and her son's future. Some scholars see this as a turning point where she becomes more cautious, focusing on internal reforms and regional diplomacy, while the Roman world burns. Others emphasize the boldness of aligning herself later with Antony, one of the principal strongmen of the new order. You sense both threads in her now, caution born of hard experience, and a readiness, when the time comes, to commit fully to a chosen course, rather than hover forever at the margins. For the moment, she moves through the halls of her court as a queen between two worlds, one foot planted on the black soil of Egypt, the other always hovering above the troubled stones of Rome. Caesar is gone, but his shadow lingers in the statue that may still stand in the Roman temple, in the memory of the Nile voyage, and most of all, in the small boy who walks beside her, a living reminder that her story and Rome's are now permanently interwoven. The next great figure from that city is already approaching the edge of her horizon, though she does not yet know it. The river flows on, as it always does, carrying the faint, distant echo of approaching oars. You feel those distant oars grow louder as the years tighten and release again, like the pull of the Nile itself. Rome's great men clash and reconcile, and clash again. In the wake of Caesar's death, the second triumvirate forms Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, dividing the Roman world like a map on a table. Battles in Greece, at Philippi, leave Caesar's assassins defeated. The eastern half of the empire falls into Mark Antony's hands, and with it, the right to question the loyalty of its kings. You follow the path of messages rather than armies. Somewhere in Syria or Cilicia, Antony's staff drafts letters, neat lines of ink on wax and papyrus, summoning rulers to account for their behavior during the civil wars. Among those names is Cleopatra's. Rumors say she once sent ships to help Caesar's side, and that a storm wrecked them. Others say Cassius, one of Caesar's killers, sought her fleet. The details blur, but the tone is clear. Antony wants answers. He calls her to Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, to explain herself. In your mind, you watch the messenger arrive in Alexandria, sea salt drying on his cloak. The letter is presented, sealed with authority. Cleopatra reads it in a quiet audience chamber, the light cutting across her face. She knows what this means. Ignoring Antony is not an option. Going to him as a supplicant would be dangerous. So she chooses a third way, one that fits the long tradition of Hellenistic queens and their carefully staged appearances. She will arrive not as a nervous vassal, but as a spectacle. Time shifts, and you are suddenly not in Alexandria but in Tarsus, feeling the dry heat of inland Anatolia on your skin. The city sits on the Cydnus River, a strip of cool water that glitters under the sun. Later stories tell that Antony once bathed here and nearly died from the shock of the cold. Whether or not that tale is precisely true, the river is known for its chill, a small piece of local colour in a place about to host a meeting that will echo across centuries. Antony is here now, a Roman triumvir and seasoned commander, surrounded by officers, scribes, and soldiers. You can picture him in the public square, used to kings and envoys coming to him with cautious humility. Word spreads that Cleopatra has delayed her arrival, attending to business in Egypt, perhaps testing his patience. When she finally sends word that she is approaching by river rather than land, curiosity thickens the air along the Cydnus banks. You stand among the crowd as they gather at the water's edge. The sun has begun to slide downward, softening colors without easing the heat. Then, from upstream, something unusual appears. A barge moving slowly, its oars dipping in precise time, the water around them breaking into regular silver ripples. Purple sails, richly dyed, billow above, catching the late breeze. The air begins to smell faintly of incense and imported perfumes, carried ahead of the ship like an announcement. This scene comes to you through Plutarch's words across centuries, and even though historians caution that he writes with an eye for drama, most accept that Cleopatra's arrival was deliberately theatrical. Musicians play on deck, attendants dressed as winged Eretes, little love gods, fan the queen as she reclines under a canopy that gleams like beaten gold. She is said to be costumed in the likeness of Aphrodite, or, as other traditions would have it, Isis, her presence, signaling not only royal authority, but divine favor. You feel Antony's mood shift as he hears the descriptions, then steps forward to see for himself. He is no impressionable youth. He has fought in Gaul and the East, sat in councils where kings begged for mercy. Yet this is something different. A ruler who comes not crawling, but cruising into his city like a living myth. Some ancient writers say he sent for her. She sent back an invitation that he dine with her instead. Whatever the exact words, the outcome is the same. The balance of approach tilts in her favor. As the barge draws alongside the quay, you hear the creak of ropes and the murmur of the crowd falling briefly silent. Cleopatra steps down in measured grace, the air around her stirred by fans and whispers. Her eyes meet Antinous across a small distance charged with politics. They speak in Greek, the common language of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, each fully at ease in it. For a moment, you are aware that both of them know what is at stake here. Egypt's autonomy, Antony's need for allies and money, and the stories that will later be told about whatever happens next. The first banquet is held not in some cramped hall, but in a setting carefully chosen to impress. Tables are laid with fine textiles, couches arranged for reclining in the Greek style. Silver and gold vessels, some perhaps from the Ptolemaic treasuries, catch the torchlight. The air smells of roasted meats, honeyed wines, and the cool, sharp notes of imported resins. Musicians play softly. Dancers move through the edges of your vision. Cleopatra has brought with her not just wealth, but a traveling version of the Alexandrian court. Antony arrives as guest rather than host, a subtle but important inversion. He has summoned her to answer for alleged misdeeds. Now he crosses her threshold. She greets him with the ease of someone who has played host to powerful men before. Her voice steady, her smile controlled but warm. As they dine, conversations weave between jest and policy. She can be witty, trading quick lines with a man known in Rome for his own rough humor. She can also be precise when discussing ships, money, and the needs of the region. Some historians believe Antony and Cleopatra may have met years earlier, when he was a young officer supporting her father's restoration to Egypt under the command of Aulus Gabinius. The sources are not entirely clear. That earlier glimpse, if it happened, would have been brief. Whether this is genuinely their first meeting or a deliberate restaging of an acquaintance from long ago, you can feel both of them using the evening to assess one another anew. She judges how far he balances ambition and indulgence. He tests how firmly she holds her throne and how far her resources might stretch. Outside, the people of Tarsus talk. Some shake their heads at the extravagance. Others are simply delighted by the spectacle. Roman officers exchange knowing looks about Antony's susceptibility to luxury. Later Roman writers will emphasize that side of him, casting Cleopatra as a temptress who ensnares a once sturdy warrior. Modern scholars, more cautious, point out how much Antony needs her. Egyptian grain, fleet, and money will be vital for his plans against Parthia and for maintaining his position in the East. They argue that it is too simple to reduce their alliance to seduction. It is, from the start, a convergence of interests dressed in silk and song. Banquets follow banquets. The Cydnus cool water glints under moonlight as torches shine on late-night gatherings. Jokes are traded, challenges issued. Plutarch recounts playful contests between Antony and Cleopatra about spending and feasting, stories that may be embroidered but likely reflect some real flavor of their interactions. A man priding himself on his ability to drink and joke with the best of them, and a queen smart enough to match him and to turn the atmosphere to her advantage. In private or semi-private councils amid the revelry, serious commitments are made. Cleopatra can promise funds and ships. Antony can confirm her position on the throne and perhaps grant her expanded territories. Over time, she will indeed receive control of places like parts of Cyprus and coastal cities. But that lies ahead. For now, the understanding is simpler. He will leave Tarsus with Egypt as a loyal, well-resourced ally. She will leave with his recognition and, very likely, with the beginnings of a partnership that stretches beyond formal politics. As the days in Tarsus draw to a close, Cleopatra invites Antony to Alexandria. It is an audacious offer, to draw one of Rome's 3 rulers into her own city, into a space she can shape and fill. Antony, perhaps flattered, perhaps simply convinced of the political good sense of staying close to a wealthy ally, accepts. Some of his advisors might frown. Wintering in a foreign capital with a famous queen will look a certain way back in Rome. But Antony has never been a man who lives purely by Roman austerity. You sense in him a streak of theatricality that responds to hers. The departure from Tarsus is quieter than the arrival, the crowd now used to the sight of the barge and its queen. The Cydnus carries them out toward the sea, its cold water pushing gently against the hull. Antony stands on deck beside Cleopatra as the city recedes, his cloak tugged by the wind, her veils fluttering in time. Above them, gulls wheel. Ahead lies the long curve of the coast and the strange bright charm of Alexandria. Historians still argue about that Tarsus meeting. Was Antony already lost to Roman virtue there, as later moralists claim, or simply making a rational, if lavishly staged, alliance with a crucial regional power? Was Cleopatra primarily playing the role of seductress, or was she a canny monarch using every tool at her disposal, including beauty, theatre, and intellect, to secure her kingdom's future? As you watch their ships slip over the horizon in your thoughts, you can let both possibilities drift together. The sails fill. The sea darkens toward evening. Behind them, Tarsus returns to its usual rhythms, the smell of incense slowly fading from its stones. Ahead, Alexandria waits with its straight streets and watching lighthouse, ready to receive a Roman triumvir as an honored guest. You float just above that turning world, feeling how a single river encounter has bent 2 lives into a shared curve, one that will carry them toward dazzling heights of power and toward a final, steep drop neither of them can yet see. The sea wind that carries Antony and Cleopatra toward Alexandria feels lighter than the dry heat of Tarsus, as if the air itself is relieved to leave Roman stone behind for the softer edges of the Nile's wide mouth. You stand on the deck with them as the Pharos lighthouse grows larger, its guiding fire a steady, golden eye in the dusk. This time, Antony arrives not as an interrogator but as an honored guest, almost as if the city itself is holding out its arms. When he steps onto the quay, Alexandria responds. Trumpets sound, troops parade in tidy lines. Citizens press forward to glimpse the famous Roman, who now walks beside their queen. Cleopatra moves through these crowds with practiced ease, introducing him to a city that has long prided itself on being the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean. Gleaming colonnades, libraries, lecture halls, and the subtle scent of the harbours brine threaded through everything. You follow them through the palace doors into a world that feels different from Rome's rigid, forum-bound gravity. Here, banquets are framed by philosophy, music, and a kind of cultivated play. Antony, who has always had a taste for soldierly roughness and camaraderie, finds in Alexandria something that matches his own boisterousness, but wraps it in silk and incense. Cleopatra, in turn, finds in him a Roman power broker who is less austere than Caesar, more willing to melt into the city's eclectic rhythms. Plutarch tells of a group they form with close companions, a sort of private society nicknamed the Inimitable Livers. Men and women who feast together, go out at night to wander the city in disguise, and engage in elaborate practical jokes. The stories are embroidered, of course, but most historians accept that Cleopatra and Antony shared a taste for theatricality and excess at times, and that Alexandria's nightlife gave them a playground. You can picture them slipping through darkened streets masked, listening at tavern doors to what people say about them, tossing coins to startle vendors, laughing louder than a pair of rulers probably should. Yet beneath the laughter, serious currents run. Antony needs money and ships for his ambitions in the east. Cleopatra needs Roman protection and the chance to extend her influence over neighboring territories. In quieter rooms, away from the fountains and music, they talk in detail about Parthia, the formidable empire to the east that had humiliated Roman armies, about the fragmented client kingdoms that dot the map from Syria down toward Egypt, about how Egypt's wealth, grain, gold, and coin from centuries of careful accumulation can be put into motion. Their relationship deepens, and with it, their families entwine. Around 40 BCE, Cleopatra gives birth to twins, a boy named Alexander Helios Sun, and a girl named Cleopatra Selene Moon. You imagine the nursery in the palace, a cool, shaded room where nurses rock the infants while outside. Courtiers already speculate on what their names might mean. Sun and moon, symbols that suggest cosmic reach, balance, a pairing that stretches beyond Egypt's own borders. Later, a younger son will follow, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Each child is another thread binding Antony to this eastern court, and each one another fact Octavian in Rome will eventually twist into accusation. For the moment, though, Antony does not stay. The Roman calendar keeps tugging at his sleeve. His wife, Fulvia, has involved herself in a messy conflict in Italy, and events at home demand his presence. He leaves Alexandria, parting from Cleopatra and his small children, and moves back into the harsh daylight of Roman politics. Fulvia will die not long afterward. Antony will then marry Octavia, the dignified sister of Octavian, in a union meant to patch up tensions within the triumvirate. You can almost feel the awkwardness of that arrangement from afar, a public gesture of Roman unity, while somewhere in Alexandria a queen raises his twins. Years pass in this divided way. Antony lives between worlds, Rome and the East, Octavia and Cleopatra, treaties and campaigns. In 37 BCE, he and Cleopatra meet again in Antioch, a major city of the Eastern Mediterranean. There, they renew their alliance with clearer terms. You stand in an Antioch audience hall as they review maps together, assigning territories. Cleopatra expands her control to include parts of Cyprus and coastal lands. Reconnecting fragments of the old Ptolemaic Empire, Antony is generous. Critics later will say too generous, accusing him of giving away Roman dependencies. Modern scholars debate how far these gifts truly represented a loss for Rome or simply formalized influence Cleopatra already had, but the perception at the time will matter more than the technicalities. Back in Alexandria, their shared world thickens. You walk through the palace during one of their famous festivals. Halls glitter with lamps polished to soft gleams. Musicians from across the Mediterranean play lyres, auloi, and drums. Philosophers and courtiers argue gently in corners about fate and virtue. Antony, sometimes mocked in Roman sources as a man who hides in silks, reclines at banquets that feel like staged performances of royal abundance. Cleopatra presides, watchful and animated, as talk ranges from military logistics to plays and poetry. It's easy for hostile later writers to paint these years as nothing but self-indulgence, a long party while Rome suffers. Yet when you listen more closely under the music, you hear the steady scratch of reed pens on papyrus. Tax reforms, land grants, diplomatic letters. The court is not just a playground, it is a government in motion. Grain still moves down the Nile. Temples maintain their rituals. Embassies from Judea, Armenia, and other kingdoms come and go, negotiating favors and borders. There is one moment, though, when the theatrical and the political merge so completely that even in your sleepy listening, you can't miss it. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE. Antony has just returned from a campaign in Armenia. The campaign did not go as smoothly as he would have hoped, but he has secured the Armenian king in chains and wants to present some kind of triumph. Rather than holding the traditional Roman ceremony in Rome, he stages something extraordinary in Alexandria. You find yourself in a grand venue. Ancient accounts suggest a gymnasium, or perhaps the great theatre, packed with Alexandrians and foreign guests. At the centre, on a raised platform, thrones have been set. Cleopatra appears in splendour, portrayed as Isis once more, her regalia mixing Egyptian and Hellenistic elements. Beside her is Caesarion, now a young boy, and the 3 children she has borne with, Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony himself stands as master of ceremonies, in a role that feels half general, half king. Trumpets sound, heralds proclaim titles. Caesarion is hailed as King of Kings, and Cleopatra as Queen of Kings, phrasing that carries a strong echo of Eastern imperial styles. Alexander Helios is declared ruler of Armenia, Media, and territories yet to be fully won from Parthia. Cleopatra Selene is given Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus receives Syria and Cilicia. These are, in many cases, territories that Rome considers within its own sphere, already claimed or overseen by Roman authorities. Even if the reality on the ground remains murky, the symbolism is not. Antony is publicly linking his power, Roman victories, and the future of Eastern lands to a dynasty centered on Cleopatra and their children. You feel the crowd's reaction, a mix of awe, excitement, and perhaps confusion. To Alexandrian eyes, this might look like the rebirth of a great Eastern monarchy that can stand alongside or even above the patchwork of Roman provinces. To Roman ears, at least as Octavian will later describe it, this ceremony sounds like treason dressed in gold. A Roman leader setting up a foreign queen and her offspring as the true masters of lands Rome has bled to control. Historians still argue over how Antony saw himself in that moment. Was he consciously turning away from Rome, dreaming of a new, blended empire ruled from Alexandria? Or was he, in his own mind, still a Roman triumvir, using the old language of Hellenistic kingship to manage the East, while assuming that Rome's ultimate supremacy remained unshaken? The surviving sources are coloured by Octavian's later propaganda, so their picture is murky, and each modern scholar shades it differently. You, watching from the back of that crowded hall, feel how the ceremony must have looked and sounded. Children small on oversized thrones, names of distant lands rolling out into incense-heavy air, a queen radiant in carefully chosen symbolism, and a Roman general who seems, at least for that evening, more Eastern king than Roman magistrate. It is dazzling and precarious at once. Afterward, the court returns to its pattern of feasts, hunts, and councils. The children grow, the twins surrounded by tutors and attendants who teach them Greek, perhaps Egyptian, and the expectations of those grand titles. Astrology, a respected field in this world, whispers that such names as sun and moon can only belong to great destinies, though the stars, like history, remain ambivalent. Down by the harbour, sailors talk about the wealth pouring into the city. In the markets, traders sell small trinkets, shaped like Isis or Alexander, echoes of the myths their rulers weave around themselves. Far to the west, though, in Rome, Octavian listens to reports and shapes them into a different kind of story. He tells senators and citizens that Antony has handed Roman lands to an Egyptian queen, that he calls Caesarion the true son of Caesar, implicitly undermining Octavian's own claim. The donations of Alexandria become a cornerstone of a campaign to portray Antony not just as a rival, but as a man who has betrayed Roman values for an Eastern queen and her brood of foreign heirs. Back in Alexandria, on a warm evening when lamps flicker against painted walls, Antony and Cleopatra recline at another banquet, perhaps laughing at a sharp joke or discussing, in low tones, the next moves in Armenia or against Parthia. The music is gentle. The river breeze finds its way even here. You stand in the doorway in your imagination, sensing how much of their world feels secure and how much of it already rests on fault lines. Love and power, children and ceremonial crowns, all glitter beautifully under the lamplight. Even as unseen, the long road toward Actium begins to form like a dark line on the horizon of their shared sky. The glitter of those Alexandrian ceremonies doesn't fade all at once. It tarnishes slowly, like silver left too long in damp air. You can feel the shift first, not in Egypt, but in the letters being written on the other side of the Mediterranean, where Octavian sits in Rome and begins to turn words into weapons. He has always been quieter than Antony, less dazzling in battle, less flamboyant at feasts, but he is methodical, patient, and deeply attuned to the mood of the Roman people. As news of the donations of Alexandria and the titles given to Cleopatra's children slid into Italy, Octavian listens, and then he starts telling a particular kind of story about his rival. In the Senate, in the Forum, in private conversations, he insists that Antony is no longer quite Roman. He says Antony has handed away Roman lands to an Egyptian queen, that he is ruled by a foreign woman's whims, that he calls Caesarion the true son of Caesar, threatening Octavian's own status as heir. You can almost hear the tone of voice, concerned, reasonable, deeply loyal to Rome. Little by little, Antony and Cleopatra become less a glamorous power couple and more a convenient symbol of everything a good Roman is supposed to resist. Back in Alexandria, those whispers are at first just a distant murmur, arriving folded in dispatches. Antony and Cleopatra read reports in rooms cool with stone and shade. The words from Rome are not flattering, but the East is still their domain. They can point to armies, fleets, treasuries. They can remind themselves that Antony once reconciled with Octavian at Brundisium, dividing spheres of influence and sealing peace with his marriage to Octavia. Perhaps, they may think, another political patch is still possible. But cracks grow. Antony sends for Octavia after the Armenian campaign, then sends her back again. His relationship with Cleopatra now undeniable. In Rome, this rejection of Octavian's sister becomes one more proof that Antony is lost to Roman virtue. Octavia's quiet dignity, returning with the troops and funds she had raised for her husband, but no longer needed by him, makes a powerful contrast. The faithful Roman matron versus the exotic, disruptive queen abroad. Octavian uses every tool he can reach. One lesser-known but potent move involves a document kept in Rome's most sacred custody. Antony has deposited his will with the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses who guard such things. According to ancient accounts, Octavian, claiming the good of the state, forces them to surrender it. He then reads it aloud, at least in part, before the Senate, or perhaps the people. The details are disputed by modern historians, but the story is clear in its general outlines. The will seems to favor Cleopatra and their children, mentioning plans for burial in Alexandria rather than in Rome. You can feel the shock ripple through those listening. To a Roman audience, the idea of one of their leading men choosing to rest in a foreign capital, tied in death to an Egyptian queen, sounds like a betrayal wrapped in marble and incense. Whether every clause was exactly as Octavian presents it or not, the effect is the same. Antony is painted as a man who has sold his Roman soul to an Eastern court. Meanwhile, Antony and Cleopatra are not idle. They prepare. In Alexandria and allied ports, shipwrights are busy. Great galleys, some large, multi-banked ships with towers for archers, take shape under hammer and saw. Forests in distant lands are felled. Their trunks floated down rivers and shipped across seas to build the ribs and spines of vessels meant to control the waves. You walk along a dock where a new hull looms above you, half clothed in planking, smelling of resin and fresh-cut wood. On these decks, troops begin to drill. Antony's forces are a mix: Roman legionaries, experienced but perhaps weary from years of civil war, allied contingents from Eastern kings, sailors from many coasts. Cleopatra contributes ships from Egypt's long maritime tradition and funds to pay men, buy grain, and keep the docks humming. She is not merely an ornament to this war machine, she helps fuel it. Some historians emphasize that her navy and treasury are indispensable to Antony's plans, making her a partner in strategy, not just in romance. In 32 BCE, the fragile peace between Antony and Octavian finally snaps. Antony divorces Octavia formally. In Rome, Octavian moves the Senate to strip Antony of his powers, accusing him of abandoning his duties and humiliating his wife. Yet when it comes time to declare war, the Senate, guided by Octavian, doesn't officially declare war on Antony, at least not in form. They declare war on Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. It is a clever move. Antony can be portrayed as a citizen misled, a general fallen under a foreign spell, while Cleopatra becomes the clear, external enemy. You feel how that twist of phrasing changes everything. This isn't just another Roman civil war, at least on the surface. It is, Octavian insists, a defense of Italy against a dangerous Eastern queen and her court. In the propaganda that follows, Egyptian images mingle with hints of magic, decadence, and un-Roman luxury. Cleopatra becomes, in Roman minds, a figure of almost mythical threat, the embodiment of an East that will unman them if they are not vigilant. Modern historians caution against taking all of Octavian's rhetoric at face value, but there is no denying its effectiveness. On the other side of the sea, Antony and Cleopatra gather their forces. Their base eventually settles in western Greece, near the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, by a promontory the Greeks call Action Actium. You step onto a hillside above the water and look down. The gulf is a deep bite into the land, a sheltered stretch of sea where ships can anchor. On one side, Antony's camp. On another, Octavian's and his talented admiral, Agrippus. Between them, the blue surface seems calm, but that calm is only the skin of a tension stretching years back. Antony's fleet is impressive in sheer size and weight. Many of his ships are heavy, multi-tiered vessels, floating fortresses bristling with towers and catapults. They are formidable in close combat, but slower and less agile. Octavian's navy, under Agrippa's direction, leans toward lighter, more maneuverable Liburnian ships, nimble like small fish darting around whales. You watch the two forces testing each other at a distance, small engagements and raids nibbling at nerves and supplies. On land, camps sprawl, tents line up in rough streets, fires burn in trenches. The smell of bread, sweat, and horses fills the air. Discontent gnaws at Antony's side as supply lines are harassed and some allies waver. Disease, as in so many ancient encampments, begins to stalk the soldiers, a quiet undercurrent of weakness that no battle standard can banish. Cleopatra's contingent stays close to Antony's, their ships anchored together, their fates increasingly joined. Even here, in this hard-edged, military landscape, there are traces of the court world you have been drifting through. Messengers run between Antony's command tent and Cleopatra's pavilion, where she may be conferring with advisors, studying charts of winds and currents, reviewing the readiness of her Egyptian crews. Some Roman officers resent her presence, muttering that a Roman war should not be steered from a queen's tent. Others, more pragmatic, know that without her money and ships, they might not be here at all. Night, by the Actian shoreline, has its own smell, salt, smoke, and the faint, sour tang of camp latrines carried on the breeze. You walk along the edge of the water in your imagination, listening to the creak of ships at anchor, the distant clatter of armor, the occasional laugh or cough from soldiers trying to sleep under foreign stars. In the distance, the opposing camps' fires glow like a second, mirrored city on the horizon. Historians will argue endlessly about the decisions made here, whether Antony should have sought a land battle instead of committing to a naval engagement, whether he and Cleopatra hoped to break out and resupply rather than crush Octavian outright, whether morale was already too compromised to risk anything bold. Later Roman writers, eager to show Antony as weakened by love, will emphasize Cleopatra's influence and presence at every turn. Modern scholars often push back, pointing to strategic constraints, supply issues, and Agrippa's skillful harassment of Antony's positions as decisive factors. You, drifting among the tents and along the shoreline, can feel how many of those factors blend together. War is rarely one clean choice. It is a thicket of bad options and narrowing paths. They have committed themselves to a shared course, joined their families, their propaganda, their finances, and they face an opponent who controls Rome's narrative and has the advantage of being able to present his cause as the defense of home against a queen of the Nile. The morning of the great battle is still ahead of you. The air tonight is thick with anticipation rather than action. In Antony's tent, maps and charts lie weighed down by cups and dagger hilts. In Cleopatra's pavilion, lamps flicker over fabrics that once saw nothing harsher than banquet light, and now glow over armor being checked and rechecked. The sea outside sighs against the shore, indifferent, as if it has watched fleets come and go since long before Rome or Alexandria existed. You pause with them in that held breath of time, feeling how the long road that began in palace corridors and river voyages has narrowed to this small strip of coast and this stretch of water. Alliances have hardened into lines of battle. Stories told in senate houses and palace halls have turned into formations of wood and bronze. Actium waits a name that will become shorthand for an ending neither side can yet bear to imagine, though in their quieter moments, both Antony and Cleopatra must feel the precipice under their feet. Dawn at Actium comes thin and pale, a colour that doesn't quite belong to either night or day. You stand on the rocky shore in your mind, feeling the coolness under your feet and the tightness in the air, like cloth stretched almost to tearing. Out on the water, Antony's ships and Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron lie at anchor, silent hulks against the dim horizon. Across the strait, Octavian's lighter, quicker vessels rest in their own tense stillness. Then movement begins. Oars rise and fall. Banners stir. Orders pass from deck to deck, carried by trumpet calls and shouted commands. In early September of 31 BCE, on a day later remembered as the second, the two fleets creep toward one another on the water between the open Ionian Sea and the shelter of the Ambracian Gulf. You can feel how many decisions, hopes, and fears are compressed into these planks and sails. Antony's line extends broad and heavy, his big, many-banked galleys forming a thick front. Cleopatra's squadron is positioned slightly to the rear and one flank, her ships distinctive with their Egyptian crews and markings. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, keeps his own line more flexible, his smaller Liburnian ships ready to dart and harry rather than simply ram and lock. From the shore inside your imagination, you watch as the distance closes. The sea darkens where hulls crowd together, white scars of wake breaking across bunched prows. Arrows and javelins arc through the air. Catapults thump. The first collisions are muffled crashes, wood against wood, followed by shouts and the clatter of men scrambling to board or repel. Smoke begins to rise here and there as firepots find their mark. This isn't a neat, chessboard engagement. It is a slow, grinding grapple. Antony's heavier ships can punch holes and bear punishment, but they are harder to maneuver when Agrippa's lighter vessels circle, probing for weaknesses. The wind shifts, the heat builds, and inside this confusion, the plan, or what is perceived later as the plan, takes shape. At some point in the chaos, Cleopatra's squadron pulls slightly back, then surges forward in a different direction, sails catching more fully. Her ships drive not deeper into the fight, but toward a gap, angling for the open sea. On the horizon, you see their sails bloom like pale flowers as they head south, away from the killing knot of ships still locked together. Antony sees it too. Perhaps it was prearranged, a breakout agreed upon if the battle bogged down. Perhaps it is a sudden decision, Cleopatra seizing a slim chance to escape encirclement. Historians still argue about that, weighing fragmentary accounts like pieces of driftwood. What they agree on is that Antony, at that crucial moment, leaves the main struggle and follows her. He takes a smaller ship, then transfers to one of hers, and together they run for the open water, most of their fleet still engaged behind them. From the shore, the sight is bewildering. The centre and right of Antony's line, deprived of their commander's presence and the Queen's squadron, fight on for hours. Some ships surrender, others burn, others manage to break away and flee. When the battle finally ends, Octavian and Agrippa hold the water. Antony's naval strength, once so fearsome, lies scattered and shattered on the waves, or under them. You follow Antony and Cleopatra instead. Their little group of ships claws southward along the Greek coast, then across open stretches of sea. The decks are crowded and weary. The air smells of salt, sweat, and a kind of stunned silence. These are not the triumphant voyages you floated through earlier. Men who have survived the melee walk with the slightly dazed step of those whose bodies are unhurt, but whose certainties have cracked. On quiet nights during that retreat, somewhere between the islands and the Egyptian shore, you can imagine Antony standing by the rail, looking back into the dark where Actium lies. A man who has fought many battles knows what defeat feels like in the flesh, the bruises, the exhaustion. But this loss carries something more, the sense that a whole world has begun to tilt away beneath his boots. Cleopatra, too, must feel the shift. The fleet she helped fund and fill has been gutted. The Roman ally she bet on has suffered a public, undeniable setback. By the time their sails catch the familiar winds near the delta, the urgency of flight has loosened into a heavy, anxious waiting. Alexandria rises again from the sea, the Pharos steady on its promontory, the quays dotted with onlookers trying to read the story in the number and condition of returning ships. You step ashore with them, feeling dust and stone underfoot, hearing the little ripples of rumor already spreading. Something went wrong, something broke. The Romans across the sea will come. Inside the palace, the mood thickens. Rooms that once echoed with the easy clink of cups and laughter now host tense councils. Maps of the Eastern Mediterranean are unrolled again, but this time there are fewer pins, fewer reliable allies. Some client kings begin to drift toward Octavian's camp, sending envoys that promise support to the rising winner. Antony and Cleopatra's circle tightens. Yet life does not simply collapse. They still have armies, still have ships, still have wealth. Cleopatra looks to the south and east, toward the Red Sea, as a possible escape route or alternate theatre. Ancient accounts say she outfits a fleet there, perhaps hoping to shift her base or secure trade routes, only to have those ships destroyed on the shore by forces allied with the Nabatean king, eager to please Rome. Modern scholars debate exactly how large and decisive this episode was, but you can feel its symbolism. Even far from Alexandria, doors are beginning to swing shut. In the city itself, Antony's fortunes waver like a weakened flame. Plutarch later describes him building a small retreat by the sea, a place called the Timonium, where he imitates the sour philosopher Timon of Athens, who despised mankind. Whether that dwelling looked exactly as described, or whether the story has been polished into a moral tale, the core is plausible. A once confident general, now marking himself as a disappointed exile even within his own stronghold. You picture him there, in a simpler cloak than before, looking out across the harbour, watching the sun set behind ships that no longer seem like extensions of his will. Alexandria watches along with you. The streets still bustle, bakers still knead dough in early dawn, fishermen still sell their catches, scholars still argue in shaded courtyards, but there is a new, brittle edge to the noise. People speak quickly, eyes flicking to see who might be listening. They have lived under Ptolemies and through Roman visits. They know when a storm is gathering. The Roman world has rarely left local politics alone for long, and now the greatest Roman of this generation, Octavian, has both the motive and the excuse to come in person. Inside the palace, preparations for defense and for appearance proceed in parallel. Ships in the harbour are refitted and drilled. Troops train in the heat, their shields catching the glare. At the same time, Cleopatra maintains ceremonies and rituals, showing herself in public as calmly as she can. Temples continue to receive offerings. Festivals are observed. She knows that panic can break a city from the inside before any legionary crosses its threshold. Envoys still move through these rooms, though fewer than before. Some come quietly to see whether Antony and Cleopatra will accept terms, whether there is room for compromise. Letters from Octavian or his agents arrive in sealed rolls, their words offering clemency on conditions that shift like sand. Among those conditions, implicit or explicit, is always the idea that Cleopatra separate herself from Antony, surrender her fleet, hand over Caesarion. Each of these points cuts close to the bone. Each demands that she trade loyalty to one person or one hope for the promise of another's mercy. Historians differ on how seriously she considered such bargains, or whether Antony ever truly contemplated stepping aside. Some sources suggest Cleopatra weighed the possibility of arranging peace for herself and her children if Antony were removed from the equation. Others see these hints as later attempts to paint her as pragmatic to the edge of cruelty. You can feel that moral fog from your quiet vantage point, and instead of choosing a tidy version, you let the uncertainty stand, a queen in a tightening ring, testing every possible opening in the net. Even in these strained months, the routines of court life continue, like music playing softly beneath the rising volume of drums. Cleopatra's children grow. Caesarion, now in his teens, studies with tutors who teach him Greek history, Egyptian rites, and perhaps the stern outline of Roman law. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus practice their letters and languages in bright, airy rooms, unaware or half aware that the territories once proclaimed theirs in the donation ceremony are slipping out of reach with every fresh report from abroad. On certain evenings, you can imagine Antony and Cleopatra sitting together in a high chamber, the city spread beneath them in the lavender light after sunset. The chatter of the streets drifts up, a softened murmur. Lamps are being lit along the main avenues. Somewhere, in one of those little wine shops they once visited in disguise, people are toasting or cursing their names. They talk quietly about troop numbers, about Octavian's movements, about possible emergencies, but perhaps also about smaller things, a memory from Tarsus, a moment on the Nile, a child's early word. For all the grand narratives history will tell about them, they are also simply two tired human beings at the end of a long, hard day, looking into a future that narrows like a corridor. Alexandria itself feels like a stage between acts. The painted walls, the colonnades, the bustling harbour, they are all still here, but you sense the pause, the intake of breath, before something irrevocable arrives. People stockpile grain quietly. Temple treasuries are inventoried more than usual. Some families make contingency plans for flight into the countryside. Others carry on as if nothing will change, because sometimes the easiest way to face a looming wave is to pretend the water will stay flat forever. Above it all, the Pharos lighthouse continues to turn its steady light out to sea, indifferent to who comes and goes. In that slow rotation, you can almost hear time itself moving, bringing Octavian's ships closer each day. The defeat at Actium is already slipping from shock into shared memory, the kind of event people reference with phrases like, before the disaster and after the battle. Now, the city holds its breath for what comes next. Not a distant naval clash, but the possibility of Roman soldiers walking its streets, their sandals loud on stone that has mostly known Greek and Egyptian footsteps. You remain there with the city in your imagination, suspended in that waiting. The harbour water laps gently at the quays. A warm wind lifts the edges of awnings in the market. Somewhere in the palace, Cleopatra considers stones and building plans for something new and final, and Antony weighs armour that may or may not be worn again. It is a fragile moment, and a strangely quiet one, just before the last act of their shared story begins. The waiting ends not with a roar, but with the sight of distant sails. You stand again on the Alexandrian harbour in your imagination, the air thick with heat and the smell of salt and tar. Far out on the bright skin of the sea, dark specks appear, more ships than any festival fleet, more purposeful than traders. As days pass, those specks grow masts and hulls, and Alexandria understands what it means. Octavian has come. The Roman advance on Egypt in 30 BCE is not just a naval show. Legions move over land as well. Fortresses and outposts that once seemed distant are swallowed one by one. You can feel the ring tightening as messages arrive, each bearing news of some town that has opened its gates or been taken. The myth of Antony's invincibility has already cracked at Actium. Now, it splinters further as allies defect and fewer banners fly his emblem. Inside Alexandria, Antony rallies what he can. Troops assemble on the city's outskirts. Chariots and cavalry kick up dust in hurried maneuvers. Cleopatra oversees preparations of her own. Grain stores checked, defences inspected, contingencies whispered about. Yet both of them must know that the balance has tipped too far. Octavian's resources are immense, his political narrative already cast. He comes as the savior of Rome from a dangerous queen and her compromised general in these last days. Cleopatra seems to turn part of her attention to stone. Ancient accounts describe her commissioning and overseeing the construction or adornment of a grand mausoleum near the palace, a tomb for herself and Antony. You picture her standing in a bright courtyard where blocks of stone are being hauled into place, dust catching in beams of sunlight. Workers chip and polish. Overseers consult diagrams. Storerooms nearby quietly fill with treasures. Gold, jewelry, fine textiles, artworks, all gathered as if she is preparing for a final, controlled descent rather than an open capture. At the same time, she does not stop negotiating. Letters are sent toward Octavian. Terms are probed. Could Egypt be spared if Antony is removed? Could Cleopatra retain a role? Could her children be protected? Some ancient writers suggest she even considered arranging Antony's death to buy her own safety. Others portray her as loyal to the end. Modern historians treat such darker claims with care, noting the Roman tendency to paint her as treacherous. But they also acknowledge that in her position, every grim option may at least have been thought about. You let that uncertainty remain, like a shadow at the edge of a lamp's circle. When Octavian's forces draw near enough, reality breaks into the palace in a more brutal way. A confused clash outside the city leads to Antony's troops faltering. Some surrender, others desert. Word reaches him that he has been betrayed, that Cleopatra has already yielded to Octavian, that deals have been cut behind his back. This report, at least in one version, is false or premature, but it hits him like a spear. In the emotional turmoil that follows, Antony chooses his own end. You keep the scene blurred and gentle. He is in a room, perhaps one overlooking the harbour he once hoped to control, armour dented in more places than he can count. The sounds outside are muddled. Distant fighting, shouted orders, footsteps running in too many directions. Having been told that Cleopatra is dead or captured, he falls on his sword, seeking to escape what he sees as inevitable humiliation. The wound does not kill him quickly. Instead, he lingers, bleeding, in pain. And then comes the realization. Cleopatra is not dead after all. Servants, loyal even in panic, carry him or help him stagger to the mausoleum where Cleopatra has taken refuge. The doors are sealed, its lower levels ready to be set alight if needed. She has locked herself inside with her treasure, unwilling to be taken easily. To bring Antony in, she has ropes or sheets lowered from an upper window. Ancient accounts, vivid and perhaps embellished, describe the sight. His body hauled upward by attendants, while she and her women strain from above, pulling him into the safety or the prison of her stone sanctuary. You imagine her in that moment, clothing smeared with blood and dust, hair loosened from its careful arrangements, face drawn tight with grief and fear. Antony, dying, is brought to her. They have little time. Whatever words passed between them are lost, turned into later speeches by dramatists and historians. But the feeling is not hard to guess. Regret, affection, bitterness at their shared defeat, perhaps a dark humour from a man who had always laughed loudest in hard times. Then he dies, in her arms or close enough, leaving her alone in the space they had meant to share, only in burial. Outside, Octavian's men consolidate their hold on the city. The fighting dwindles. The Roman eagle begins to cast its shadow over Alexandria's streets more securely with each passing hour. Octavian himself enters the city with a combination of caution and ceremony, aware that Cleopatra has not yet been taken. The queen in the mausoleum is still a factor political, symbolic, and personal. Rome's new master understands that how he handles her will shape both his triumph and his reputation. Eventually, contact is made. Cleopatra, shut up in her stone refuge with some of her women, must deal with messages from Octavian. He wants her alive. A living Cleopatra can be displayed in Rome in a triumphal procession, a vivid trophy proving to the people that he has conquered the exotic East. She, in turn, has no desire to walk in chains through Roman streets under mocking eyes. her story reduced to a spectacle. That fear will guide her last choices. Octavian arranges at least one meeting. You step into the mausoleum's antechamber in your imagination as she prepares to see him. She takes care with her appearance. Not gaudy, not broken, but dignified, perhaps wearing clothing that nods to both Egyptian and Greek traditions. A queen receiving a conqueror on her own ground. Octavian enters not as a wild general, but as a controlled, almost chilly figure, eyes taking in everything, the treasures piled around, the lines of her face, the calm she projects. They speak through interpreters, or in Greek, a language he likely understands well enough. Cleopatra pleads for her children's future, especially for Caesarion. She may seek to test Octavian's intentions, offering wealth, perhaps even personal charm, to see whether there is any path that spares her public humiliation and preserves some shred of autonomy. Octavian, however, is careful. Ancient writers describe him resisting any attempt by her to sway him emotionally, keeping his responses measured. He promises that she will be treated well if she submits, but he will not guarantee the safety of all she asks for, not Caesarion, whose very name is a threat to his own claim, nor the shape of Egypt's future. Historians still debate the nuances of this meeting, but most agree on its broad mood. A queen bargaining for dignity with a victor who already holds most of the cards. After he leaves, she understands more clearly how narrow her path has become. Octavian has asked that she move from the mausoleum into more ordinary quarters, a step closer to being in Roman custody. She agrees in form, but inside, she is making other plans. Ancient sources say she begins collecting poisonous substances, experimenting carefully on condemned prisoners to see which brings the least pain, which quickest sleep. Whether this exact detail is literal or a later embroidery, it captures something true about her intent. She does not plan to be dragged alive into a triumph. The method of her death has become one of history's most famous questions. The classic story, told since antiquity, is that she arranges to have a small basket of figs brought to her, concealing within it an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake. After bathing and dressing in royal attire, she takes the snake to her breast or arm, or allows it to bite her, and dies with her attendants Eros and Charmion by her side. Modern scholars have raised doubts. Transporting and controlling a snake safely, the time it would take for the venom, the lack of definitive marks reported by sources, all invite skepticism. Other theories suggest a fast-acting poison, perhaps carried in a hairpin or ointment. What most agree on is that she orchestrates her own death deliberately, in a way that leaves Octavian with a corpse instead of a captive. You picture the scene gently, without needing to choose a single precise method. The room is quiet, the thick stone walls of the mausoleum holding in the coolness. Cleopatra has bathed. Her hair is arranged as carefully as on any festival day. She wears a diadem, the slender band that marks her as queen, and garments that speak of both her heritage and her chosen roles. Perhaps a hint of Isis, perhaps the simpler lines of a Hellenistic ruler. Her two closest attendants stand with her, their faces set. She may say a few last words about her children, about Antony, about the city beyond these walls, but you let them remain unquoted, private. Then she takes the chosen means into her own hands. Whether it is the snake of legend, coiling cool and heavy against her skin, or a draught disguised amid familiar scents, the result is the same. A softness spreading through her limbs, a loosening of breath and tension. She lies down on a couch prepared for this moment, her profile turned towards some point where the light falls gently. Her women remain near, loyal even now, sharing her fate, closing this chapter of the Ptolemaic story in a small, contained space rather than on the wide streets of Rome. When Octavian's men finally force their way in, or are admitted, it is too late. They find her body, calm in death, and the bodies of her attendants. One of the women, according to Plutarch, adjusts the diadem on her queen's head with a last, small gesture. Octavian, seeing this, feels a mixture of frustration and perhaps grudging respect. She has denied him one of the greatest prizes of his triumph, but she has also removed a living rallying point for any future opposition. Historians still debate Cleopatra's legacy. Was she reckless or shrewd? An ambitious monarch trapped in Rome's inevitable rise? Or a visionary trying to carve out a space for Egypt in a world of empires? They argue over whether her last act was pure despair, a final assertion of royal dignity, or a complex calculus that weighed her children's prospects against the spectacle of her own humiliation. From your quiet place in the story, you can feel elements of all those interpretations resting in the silence of that mausoleum. Outside, Alexandria goes on breathing. The harbour water laps at the quays as it always has. Somewhere, children chase each other between market stalls. Scribes sharpen their reeds and note the date of a new ruler's arrival. The Queen of Egypt has chosen to slip away on her own terms, leaving the living to decide what her life will mean. The Romans will take her story west and reshape it. Her descendants, scattered, will carry her blood into other courts. For the moment, though, her city is left with an absence, a throne empty, a palace bereft, and the heavy stillness that follows the closing of a stone door. The news of Cleopatra's death moves through Alexandria like a hush. You feel it in the way voices drop in the market, in the way footsteps echo a little more loudly under the colonnades. Word spreads quickly. The Queen is gone. Antony too. Whatever else may be disputed later, that fact settles over the city like fine dust. Octavian now has the living world of Egypt in his hands. He moves through the palace, not as a guest this time, but as a new master, inspecting a house he intends to keep. The halls are familiar in their lines, Greek columns, Egyptian motifs, but their atmosphere has changed. Guards in Roman armor stand at thresholds. Latin commands cut across the softer sounds of Greek and Egyptian speech. The smell of incense still lingers in some chambers, but beneath it you catch traces of leather, sweat, and metal oil from Roman gear. One of his first concerns is not stone, but children. Cleopatra's offspring are still here. You stand at the edge of a quiet room where they are gathered, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the twins, no longer infants, their younger brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and, somewhere close in time if not in that same room, Caesarion, the eldest, a teenager on the cusp of manhood. The weight of names hangs heavy around them. Sun, moon, beloved of the people, son of Caesar. Each name is now a question for Octavian to answer. For Caesarion, the decision is especially stark. A son of Cleopatra, and, as she claimed, of Julius Caesar himself. He embodies a dangerous possibility. In a world where legitimacy and bloodlines matter, a young man who can be presented as Caesar's natural son threatens Octavian's own position as heir and future ruler. Ancient sources report that Caesarion is sent away toward Upper Egypt or beyond, perhaps in an attempt to hide or escape, but that he is eventually captured or surrendered. The end, when it comes, is quiet and efficient. You do not see it directly. The sources do not dwell on the details, and neither should you. A brief order, a discreet execution, the careful Latin phrase that survives later too many Caesars is not good carries a chilling practicality. With Caesarion's death, the last direct, living link between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar is cut. For the younger children, the calculus is different. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus are not immediate threats in the same way. They carry royal blood and resonant names, but they lack a clear Roman claim. Octavian chooses not to kill them. Instead, he takes them with him away from their birthplace, across the sea, into a future that will fold them into Roman-managed narratives. Before he leaves, he settles Egypt's status. The old Ptolemaic kingdom is not given to a new client king. Instead, it becomes a Roman province, essentially his personal domain. A governor, officially a prefect rather than a senator, is appointed to oversee it. But the grain, wealth, and land ultimately answer to Octavian. You feel the shift like a subtle tilting of the landscape. The Nile still floods, the fields still green, but the taxes now flow toward a different capital. The journey west begins. You follow the Roman fleet again, though this time it carries not a triumphant Cleopatra as honored guest, but her children as carefully guarded captives. The sea feels similar beneath the hulls, but the mood is different. On deck, the twins perhaps cling to one another when the waves tilt their world. Ptolemy Philadelphus peers over the side, the spray on his face tasting of salt and something else uncertainty, maybe, though he cannot name it. Rome looms ahead, louder and busier than ever. When Octavian enters the city in 29 BCE, he comes prepared to celebrate a series of victories. Over Illyricum, over Antony, over Egypt, a triple triumph. You drift along the streets as they are dressed for the occasion. Garlands hung across alleys, temporary arches built of wood and plaster, people jostling for vantage points. The air smells of crushed flowers, sweat, dust, and the anticipation of spectacle. In that spectacle, Cleopatra appears not in person, but in image. Processional floats and tableaux present her story as Octavian wants it told. You catch glimpses as they pass, painted scenes of a queen bowing before a virtuous Roman conqueror, caricatured figures representing luxurious Eastern excess, perhaps even a model of the Nile or Alexandria. A mannequin or painting might show Cleopatra in chains, a theatrical symbol of a woman who in fact chose to die rather than be paraded. Among the human participants are her children. The twins and their little brother walk or are carried through the streets as part of the Egyptian triumph, dressed in finery that recalls the donations of Alexandria, perhaps crowns, exotic garments, ornaments signaling their former royal status. The crowd reacts with a complex mix of curiosity, pity, and satisfaction. Here is proof that the royal line has been broken and tamed, its heirs reduced from throned figures on a stage to ornaments in someone else's celebration. You linger for a moment on Cleopatra Selene. Unlike Caesarion, she will live to leave a clearer mark on the historical record. After the triumph, the children are placed in the household of Octavia, Octavian's sister, and Antony's former wife. Octavia, by all accounts a woman of rare dignity and kindness, raises them alongside her own children. The shift is enormous. From the shimmering halls of Alexandria to a Roman domestic sphere shaped by a woman who has lost husband and political standing, but not her sense of duty. As years pass, opportunities and decisions begin to reshape the twins' fates. Around the late 22nd BCE, Octavian, on his way to becoming Augustus, the first Roman emperor, arranges a marriage for Cleopatra Selene. You follow her south and west to Mauritania, in North Africa, where she is wed to Juba II, a scholarly and Romanized king, who himself was once a child taken in triumph, the son of a defeated Numidian ruler. Their union is a binding of two once hostile royal lines into something newly useful to Rome. In Mauritania's capital, later called Caesarea in honor of Augustus, you imagine Cleopatra Selene overseeing architectural projects, introducing touches of Alexandrian taste to a coastal African city. Archaeological traces and later hints suggest that she and Juba create a court where Greek, Roman, and North African influences mingle. Libraries, temples, perhaps even a lighthouse reminiscent of the Pharos. The daughter of Cleopatra and Antony, raised in Rome, becomes a queen in her own right, carrying forward fragments of her mother's legacy in stone and ritual, if not in direct political independence. Her brother's stories fade more quickly. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the record after childhood. Their exact fates are not clearly documented. Some historians think they may have died young, perhaps from illness in a world where childhood mortality was tragically common. Others speculate about quiet, unremarked lives in the background of Roman or Allied society. You respect that uncertainty, letting them drift into the soft anonymity that claims so many ancient lives, remembered more for their symbolic roles than for what they themselves thought or felt. Back in Rome, Octavian shapes his triumph not just through parades, but through narrative. He has statues raised, coins struck, and monuments inscribed with messages about restoring peace and order to a world shattered by civil war. Antony becomes, in this story, the cautionary example, a Roman noble undone by the seductions of the East and by his own lack of discipline. Cleopatra becomes the dangerous queen, the foreign temptress whose influence threatened to pull Rome away from its hard, manly virtues. Modern scholars point out how calculated this image is. It serves Octavian's purposes perfectly. By blaming a foreign queen for much of the conflict, he can frame his victory as a defense of Roman identity rather than simply the last chapter of a brutal Roman-on-Roman struggle. Yet even as you see the propaganda, you can also sense why it sticks. Cleopatra was indeed extraordinarily educated, multilingual, theatrical in her rulership, and Antony did indeed merge his fate with hers in ways that were easy to caricature. As Augustus settles into power, Egypt recedes from the daily talk of Rome's streets, becoming one province among many, albeit a particularly rich and carefully guarded one. Senators need special permission to travel there. Its grain is considered too crucial to be left to anyone but the emperor's trusted agents. The Nile's floods continue, the temple festivals proceed. But now statues of pharaohs are joined by images of Augustus in pharaonic style, the old visual language serving a new master. You step back for a moment, looking at the wide arc you've just travelled. Cleopatra's children have scattered like seeds, one cut down for being too much like Caesar, one growing into a queen who will rule from a different shore, others fading into history's background noise. Octavian's triple triumph has fixed the story of their mother and of Antony in Roman marble and bronze, yet it has not entirely erased the quieter truths of what they tried to build, a shared Eastern vision, however flawed and fragile. In the streets of Rome, as the triumphal arches are dismantled and ordinary business resumes, you can imagine the children of that city retelling simplified versions of the story: the bad queen, the weak general, the wise Augustus. In Mauritania, perhaps, Cleopatra Selene walks at evening along the sea wall, smelling a different salt air, thinking of a lighthouse far away and a mother whose name will always outshine her own, even as her own life proves that defeat in one city does not entirely end a lineage or a legacy. The story has left Alexandria for now, carried in ships, in laws, in blood. But in that city by the Nile, where the palaces still stand and the library shelves, whatever their state, still hold scrolls, people have their own memories of the Queen and her Roman. Those memories will mingle with the official Roman version and with the later Greek and Latin texts, slowly crystallizing into the many, sometimes contradictory Cleopatras that the centuries will inherit. You stay with that image of Cleopatra Selene on the Mauritanian shore for a moment, breathing in the imagined salt air with her, and then you let time swell and roll forward like a long, slow wave. The sharp edges of events begin to soften. People who once spoke of Cleopatra as a recent queen, whose dress they remembered, age, and die. Those who knew Antony's voice directly are gone. What remains are stories, and the way those stories are told becomes its own battlefield. You drift first through Roman rooms, lit by oil lamps and warmed by coals. Senators in old age, who saw Octavian's triumph as young men, tell tightly framed versions of what happened. Antony, the fallen hero; Cleopatra, the dangerous enchantress; Augustus, the savior who restored order. You can hear how the details are picked and polished. Cleopatra is seldom described as a scholar or as a ruler, balancing budgets and river floods. She is reduced to perfume, jewels, and the suggestive tilt of her head. It's easier, after all, to blame a foreign queen for civil war than to dwell on the uncomfortable fact that Roman politics devoured its own without foreign help. Over time, biographies and histories fix these impressions into text. Roman and Greek authors like Plutarch and later Cassius Dio begin to shape the Cleopatra you and so many others will meet first when you open a book. Plutarch, writing more than a century after her death, gathers anecdotes, letters, and earlier accounts, some careful, some gossip. You feel him working by lamplight, sifting tales from Egypt, Rome, and the provinces, trying to balance admiration and moral warning. He emphasizes her charm, her wit, the way she could make even ordinary conversation seem like music. He portrays her as intelligent and cunning, but also as a woman whose relationship with Antony draws him away from sober Roman virtue. Even here, In a text that many later writers treat as foundational, you can sense the mixture: moralizing, curiosity, and a certain fascination. Plutarch is not a court propagandist. He is a biographer, interested in character. He notes, for example, that Cleopatra's charm was not simply physical beauty, that her voice, her presence, her learning played as large a role as her appearance. It's a small, less quoted detail, but it hints at the complexity behind the larger caricature. As centuries pass, the empire changes. Emperors come and go. The empire divides. Christianity spreads. The old gods of Egypt and Rome retreat into memory. Yet Cleopatra's name stays afloat, bobbing up in sermons and commentaries as an example of worldly temptation and the dangers of luxury. A preacher in late antiquity might hold her up to warn against the ruinous power of passion. A moral writer might use her as a cautionary figure, standing for the idea that even the clever can be undone by desire. You drift further into medieval scriptoria, where monks bend over wooden desks, copying ancient texts in careful script. The lamps are smaller here. The world outside is different fields and forests instead of marble forums. But still, Plutarch's words pass under their pens, then into Latin and onward. Cleopatra, in this telling, is often more symbol than person, a figure wrapped in the same cautionary cloth as Jezebel or Delilah, or any woman whose story has been pressed into the service of warning men about women. Yet some copyists, some readers, may pause at a line or two about her languages, her daring, her last refusal to be paraded, and see something more than a mere seductress. In the Islamic world, where Egypt belongs to new caliphates and dynasties, Cleopatra appears under different names and shades, woven into local chronicles and legends. Some later Arabic writers remember her less as a temptress and more as a wise ruler, a builder of monuments, a patron of learning. You can imagine scholars in medieval Cairo discussing stories of an ancient queen who understood astronomy and philosophy, her image shaped by their own values and by the ruins around them. The same woman who, in Roman mouths, becomes shorthand for dangerous passion, can, in other traditions, tilt toward philosopher queen. Then the Renaissance comes, and with it, a renewed appetite in Europe for classical stories. Humanists seek out Greek manuscripts, including Plutarch. Artists and poets look for material that blends drama, romance, and moral weight. Cleopatra, with her tragic love affair and spectacular end, is irresistible. You walk through a 16th century study in Italy or France, shelves lined with newly printed texts. A playwright or poet sits by a window, the light fall knotting over a copy of Plutarch's Lives. They pause at the passages about Cleopatra and Antony in Alexandria, about the inimitable feasts, the river barge at Tarsus, the asp in the fig basket. You can almost see the creative spark leap in their eyes. Here is material that can move an audience: grand love, war, downfall, all nestled in the folds of historical prose. Soon, Cleopatra steps onto the stage. In paintings, she is often shown in the moment of death, reclining on a couch, bare skin pale against dark fabrics, a small snake coiled at her breast or wrist. Artists from the Renaissance into the Baroque era seize on the sensual charge of that last scene, sometimes more than on its political significance. You wander through galleries where canvases show jeweled armlets, overturned cups, and fainting handmaidens, the queen's body arranged as elegantly in dying as in life. On the page, too, she grows. In the early 17th century, you find yourself in an English theatre, the wooden beams of the globe above you, the groundlings murmuring. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra brings her to life in English verse, a Cleopatra who is witty, mercurial, manipulative, loving, and defiantly herself. Her first entrance is electric, her last is majestic. The play leans into the conflict between Rome's hard, disciplined world and Egypt's lush, improvisational one. Shakespeare faithfully draws from Plutarch, but he also adds layers of paradox. She is both vain and profound, both cruel and vulnerable, both liar and truth-teller. You listen to lines that will echo through centuries. Antony calling her a lass unparalleled, Cleopatra imagining immortalizing their story in some squeaking Cleopatra boy, my greatness. The irony touches you. In real Elizabethan theatres, indeed, a boy actor in a dress is playing her. Historians still debate how closely this stage Cleopatra mirrors the historical queen. Literature lovers simply feel the human complexity. As time moves into the 18th and 19th centuries, Cleopatra becomes a favorite of Romantic and Victorian imaginations. You drift into salons, where poets and novelists speculate about the emotional inner life behind the ancient accounts. Orientalist painters, fascinated by imagined Eastern luxuriance, put her in ever more elaborate costumes and interiors, often revealing more about European fantasies than about Ptolemaic Egypt. Marble busts and oil portraits show her with features that align neatly with the artist's own ideals of beauty, whether European, Middle Eastern, or a blend. Throughout all this, scholars and antiquarians begin to dig literally as well as metaphorically. Archaeology in Egypt grows more systematic. Papyri are unearthed and slowly deciphered. Coins bearing Cleopatra's profile are studied closely. On these coins, you see a face different from the idealized, sensual beauty of so many paintings. A strong nose, a firm chin, a somewhat severe profile that suits a capable ruler more than a languid seductress. Modern historians note that Hellenistic royal portraits were often stylized to convey power and kinship, and they caution against reading too much personal likeness into them. Still, the contrast with the romanticized Cleopatra is striking. As the 20th century arrives, new technologies and new approaches to history change her again. Films cast actresses whose faces become Cleopatra for global audiences, silent-era stars. Then, famously, Elizabeth Taylor, with her dark eyeliner and massive set-piece palace. These movies mix slices of genuine history with Hollywood scale, leaning heavily on the love story, the jewels, the grandeur, sometimes flattening her political acumen into the background. Yet they also, for many, awaken a desire to learn more about the woman behind the spectacle. Historians, meanwhile, revisit the sources with fresh questions. They ask what it meant for Cleopatra to be a Macedonian Greek queen ruling an Egyptian land, how she navigated the expectations of priests and Greek elites, how she used religious roles, especially as Isis, to legitimize her rule. They ask how much of her negative portrayal in Roman texts is propaganda, and how much may reflect real ruthlessness in a high-stakes world. Some argue that she was primarily a pragmatic stateswoman trying to preserve her kingdom in the face of a superpower's expansion. Others see her as someone whose ambitions genuinely reached beyond Egypt, toward a larger Eastern dominion that naturally collided with Rome. You listen to these debates the way you might listen to waves lapping at slightly different rhythms along the same shore. One scholar points to her multilingualism and decrees that show concern for taxation and temple relations. Another emphasizes her readiness to gamble on Antony and to stage grand ceremonies like the donations of Alexandria. Many agree on one thing: the caricature of Cleopatra as merely a scheming seductress does not do justice to the evidence of her political involvement, her learning, and her careful crafting of image. In quieter corners of libraries and classrooms, new voices ask other questions about how race, gender, and empire shaped the way her image was used and reused. They note that each age remakes Cleopatra in its own likeness: Renaissance queen of passion, Victorian exotic temptress, mid-20th century glamour icon, late 20th and 21st century strategic leader, reclaimed by feminist historians. Some scholars point out that the fiercest debates about what she looked like often tell you more about modern anxieties than about ancient genetics. Through all of this, you remain there, just off to the side, watching her story refract into many colors. The palace corridors you walked earlier are long gone, their stones buried or swallowed by later buildings and the sea. But in plays, paintings, novels, films, and scholarly arguments, Cleopatra moves, still speaking in Greek, in Latin, in English, and Arabic and French, in every language that has tried to pin her down. Historians still argue, and will probably go on arguing, whether she was primarily a shrewd survivor caught in the machinery of empire, an overreaching monarch who gambled too high, or a symbol onto whom later ages have projected their fears and desires. As you listen to those arguments fade into the nighttime hush, you can let all those versions drift around you, like different reflections of the same moon on the Nile's surface, each one shimmering, none of them quite the whole river. You stay with those shifting reflections on the Nile a little longer, and then, gently, you let the centuries roll right up to where you are now, lying in a dark room, phone or laptop glowing faintly, listening to the echo of a queen who has been dead for more than 2,000 years and yet refuses to lie still. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel how she lives in the present, in book covers and movie posters, in documentaries with slow panning shots over ruins, in debates on television panels, and in university classrooms. Somewhere right now, a student is underlining her name in a thick history textbook. Somewhere else, a scriptwriter is staring at a blank page, trying to decide if their Cleopatra will be clever, cruel, romantic, wounded, or all of those at once. You drift for a moment into a modern museum. Glass cases gleam under focused lights. The air smells faintly of dust, metal, and cleaning solution. Behind one sheet of glass lies a small silver coin from the 1st century BCE, stamped with Cleopatra's profile on one side and Antony's on the other. Her nose is strong, her chin firm, the features stylized in the language of Hellenistic power. On another wall, a photograph shows a relief at Dendera in Egypt, where Cleopatra and her son, Caesarion, are carved presenting offerings to Egyptian gods, hieroglyphs curling around them like reed-framed whispers. These are sturdy little pins in the board of history, objects that tie all the floating stories back to something hard and cold and real. Scholars stand in front of these objects with notebooks and cameras, arguing gently about what they can and cannot say. What did Cleopatra look like? How much Egyptian ancestry did she truly have? Was her public self-identification with Isis a genuine spiritual commitment, a political performance, or both? Some historians emphasize the Macedonian Greek roots of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Others point to the likelihood of earlier intermarriages and local alliances that may have made her heritage more mixed than royal propaganda acknowledged. Most agree that the evidence is fragmentary, and that modern obsessions with pinning her into one simple category of identity often tell you more about our time than hers. You move from the museum into a cinema, the air cooled and smelling of popcorn and upholstery. On the giant screen, Cleopatra appears again, this time as a 20th century actress with elaborate eyeliner and towering headdresses. The 1963 film Cleopatra, with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, flickers before you in memory. Colossal sets, immense crowds, the Queen's entrance into Rome staged as pure golden spectacle. The movie is not a precise lesson in history. It folds timelines, decorates facts, but it leaves a deep imprint on popular imagination. For many people, that Cleopatra is the one who lingers, radiant, glamorous, forever framed by Hollywood lighting. Elsewhere, on smaller screens, other versions play. A documentary cuts between shots of the Nile, computer reconstructions of Alexandria, and experts speaking in calm tones about newly examined papyri. A stage production in a small theatre reimagines her as a sharp-tongued politician in a modern suit. A novel set in her court tells the story from the viewpoint of a servant, trying to peer past the Queen's public mask. Some retellings place her in a modern city entirely, using her as a metaphor for women negotiating power, reputation, and desire in public life now. In Egypt itself, she is woven into a different pattern of meaning. Tour guides in Alexandria and Cairo speak of her to visitors as part of a long national story, one thread among pharaohs, conquerors, and revolutionaries. School children learn her name in Arabic. Local writers sometimes recast her as a symbol not of exotic otherness, but of home, a reminder that this land has always known powerful women and complex politics. The ancient queen becomes, in some modern Egyptian narratives, less of an outsider queen from a Greek dynasty and more of a reclaimed daughter of the Nile. You slip into a quiet university seminar room, somewhere far from the river. A few students sit around a table, copies of ancient texts open in front of them. The professor asks, "Who was Cleopatra?" "Really?" And the answers come in softly. A strategist, a victim of Roman propaganda, a monarch trying to keep her kingdom alive, a romantic heroine, a villain, a symbol of Orientalism. They talk about the way Roman authors wrote about Eastern queens, often framing them as dangerous, supernaturally influential, and morally suspect. They unpack how those older biases have seeped into later centuries. One student points out that when a woman uses beauty and charm in politics, ancient authors often call it manipulation. When a man uses charisma and flattery, they call it leadership. Some historians argue that Cleopatra's true legacy lies in her failure, that she could not stop Roman expansion, could not save the last independent Hellenistic kingdom. Others answer that survival isn't the only measure of significance. They see in her life a vivid snapshot of a world in transition, where old methods of rule, divine kingship, dynastic marriages, face-to-face diplomacy were colliding with the more impersonal machinery of a Roman imperial state. In that view, Cleopatra is not simply a tragic heroine. She is a lens through which you can watch one era give way to another. Of course, outside classrooms, her image is also used in lighter ways. Cosmetics brands borrow her name for eyeliner and perfumes, hinting that a sweep of colour might give you her legendary allure. Costume catalogues sell Cleopatra dresses in shimmering gold, without much reference to tax reforms or polyglot diplomacy. Social media posts spin jokes about Cleopatra's skincare routine or Cleopatra-level drama. The ancient queen drifts through memes and marketing, sometimes flattened to a stereotype, sometimes unexpectedly sparking deeper curiosity in someone who thought they were just scrolling. At the same time, serious archaeological work continues. Underwater teams map the sunken parts of ancient Alexandria, where earthquakes and subsidence have swallowed whole districts. Other excavations at sites like Taposiris Magna on the coast west of the city search for any sign of Cleopatra and Antony's true burial place, hoping for a tomb that might, at last, answer some lingering questions. So far, there has been no universally accepted discovery, no definitive "here she is." Some scholars think the tomb may simply never be found, confused among many, or lost entirely to time. Others hold on to the idea that a sealed chamber still waits in the earth, keeping its secrets until spades and sonar and patience find the right spot. You wander mentally through a modern library as evening falls. On one shelf stand weighty biographies that try to strip away layers of legend. On another, slim volumes of poetry that lean into the legend, turning her into a symbol of love, loss, and defiance. Some authors emphasize her as a ruler, the Greek-speaking queen who took the trouble to learn Egyptian, who walked in temples as pharaoh, who issued decrees that tried to ease tax burdens and protect agriculture. Others center her loves, weaving a story of passion that burns so brightly it scorches empires. The truth likely holds all of this together, a woman who was both head and heart, both calculating and capable of genuine attachment, both shaped by her times and determined to shape them in return. In the end, historians still argue whether Cleopatra should be remembered first as a monarch who miscalculated, as a victim of Rome's unstoppable growth, as a brilliant strategist who simply ran out of options, or as a mirror in which each age has seen its own fantasies and fears. For you, lying here listening, she can be something simpler and quieter, a human being who stood at the meeting point of river and sea, of gods and parliaments, of papyrus and marble, and tried, with all the tools she had, to hold her world together while the tide rose around her. Wind down now. As you let that thought rest, the palace corridors you've been walking in your imagination begin to empty. The marble floors, once busy with servants and scribes, grow still. Lamps burn down to smaller flames, then to faint red embers. The painted walls keep their stories, but they no longer need to perform them for anyone. They simply sink back into the dark, like ships at anchor when the harbour finally sleeps. Outside, Alexandria's streets quiet. The cries of merchants and clatter of wagons fade, leaving only the soft shuffle of a few late walkers and the distant hush of waves nudging the harbour stones. One by one, shutters close. One by one, Windows go dark. The Pharos lighthouse still turns its steady light over the sea, but even that beam feels slower now, less like a summons and more like a calm, rhythmic breath. In a different part of the world, in a different century entirely, a library reading room stands empty. The heavy books about Cleopatra and Rome and ancient Egypt rest peacefully on their shelves. No one is tracing lines under her name now. No one is arguing quietly over footnotes. The pages hold their ink in silence, waiting for tomorrow. Tonight, even history is allowed to close its eyes. You are far from the Nile, far from Rome, far from those old quarrels over who was right and who was wrong. All of that noise belongs to the past. Here, in your own bed, the only river that matters is the slow, gentle current of your breathing. The weight of your blankets is steady. The room around you is safe. Whatever storms Cleopatra faced, whatever empires rose and fell around her, they are finished now, folded neatly between the centuries. If you picture the sky above you, you might see it as another kind of ancient dome, wide, dark, quiet, with faint stars pricking through, the same stars that once watched over palace roofs and desert caravans and night fishermen on the Nile. They have seen queens and conquerors come and go, and they keep shining anyway, indifferent and kind. So you can let the last light in this story dim, the last footsteps fade down stone corridors, the last whisper of river water slide away into the dark. You are here, in your own time, in your own small corner of the world, wrapped up and still, while all those old centuries turn to a soft, distant murmur. And as history closes its heavy books for the night, the quiet stars of another age watch over your dreams.